All right, so we're live. I'm here today with Professor Matt McManus, and this is a little bit of a surprising stream for me because really since 2019, I've kind of been offering this conversation to a variety of different left-wing personalities, usually academics who study the right wing, and this is the first time we've ever had it. I've talked to you, Professor, what was it, 2020, about your book on the postmodern.
Oh yeah,
I want to say postmodern
conservatism. Yeah, back in
yeah,
the
yeah. That was tail end of COVID, I suppose. This is something that the challenge always for this type of conversation for myself was to speak to the right wing, not about them.
Sure.
So I mean, the frame of the debate is really to speak to me, not Milo Yiannopoulos or online charlatans or 4chan trolls. And this is something, I guess I'll start off with this. I am somebody who is very much in opposition to the status quo and wants to see radical change.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also been very well known in right-wing circles for believing that there has to at some point be a synthesis between left and right.
Sure.
That the resolution between these two perspectives has to be essentially dissolved or unified. Obviously, there's a lot of parameters how this process has to occur, in my opinion. But this is always the challenge, is that I don't necessarily think that the left wing has the correct model of how the right wing thinks about these issues. And I guess I'll start kind of asking you generally, how do you characterize the right-left conflict? Because as I see it, their problem isn't Trump. People are complaining about Trump. Your problem isn't Trump. Your problem is the 35 to 40% of the people who will vote for Trump or DeSantis, or really anybody who opposes progressive social views. How do you see this resolving?
I think Trump has been pretty good for me. He probably is the basis of my academic career. So I should send the guy a check at some point.
Well, you and the New York Times.
That's for sure.
If you look at the mainstay of progressive YouTube, an enormous amount of their energy is just critiquing the right. For instance, all of the people, I follow people on BreadTube quite frequently. They were all talking about revolution in 2020. All they do now is complain about Tucker Carlson.
Well, and Joe Biden, right? We got our fangs out for him also. Right?
I don't see much criticism of Joe Biden. Maybe. I saw more criticism of Joe Biden during the primary than I do now, at least on the left channels. Maybe in academia, maybe behind closed doors, that's what's going on. But how do you see this process resolving itself, I suppose, would be my first question.
Sure. Well, first off, I wanted to say thanks for having me on. I did actually enjoy our chat last time, and I did think that you were polite and collegial. So that's kind of what incentivized me to come back.
All right.
Dad and President Sunday actually said that he watched that show and he enjoyed it. So,
that's not going to earn you many friends in this circle.
I didn't think so, no, but I'm a fan of his channel. But I think what we could start with is actually just discussing what distinguishes the right from the left. And the way that I conceive of it is there's two ways that we can talk about this. One is political, which is obviously what I think the meat and potatoes of our discussion is going to be. But the other is kind of fun, and it's metaphysical. So I'm wondering, do you want me to talk about the metaphysical distinction between right and left, or the political distinction between right and left? We can go do both.
Well, I don't know. I can just tell you. I think there's this core misunderstanding that I think the left has that I see come up in Corey Robin, and I always answer this. You assume that the right has got principled positions that are practical positions or that are derivations of other principles. The right really only has a few principles. We want to preserve the survival of human race and its relationship with God. And as a means to that, we seek the survival of our peoples, our culture, and our posterity, both in the religious, mimetic, and genetic sense. And the survival of our traditions as a mechanism for carrying that forward in time. For instance, there's no principled right-wing position on this. Is sort of, I think, projection. Really, there's a principled left-wing position for egalitarianism. There's no principled right-wing position for hierarchy. Hierarchy is derived from two principles: justice I mean, I guess like Evola and some people who have like this crazy spiritual idea of hierarchy, and there's sort of a spiritual idea of hierarchy in Christianity too.
Well, and Nietzsche really, and Scruton and a few other people, Kirk. Stuff.
Well, I mean, but this would be an extension of justice. So the things, Christian hierarchy would be an extension of justice, and the rest of the right wingers' idea of hierarchy comes completely from practical political concerns. I mean, this is not a principle. For instance, I always say there's nothing more right wing than a monastery. There's nothing more left wing than a Maoist struggle session. Which is more equal? Well, it's a meaningless question, right? Like,
well, I would actually say that there's nothing more left wing than a fucking hippie commune with a bunch of people doing peyote and seeing what God will say to them. But we can agree.
Hippie communes turn into Maoist struggle sessions when you introduce money. As I have
when they introduce money, I think everybody turns into a Maoist struggle session. But look, I think that I just want to start by demarcating the way that I understand the right before we start mincing these kind of distinctions. So my metaphysical understanding of the political right goes back to Aristotle. And my basic understanding of this, looking at the work of people like, say, Robert Filmer, or more recently, Jonathan Finnis, is there's a deep nostalgia for what we might broadly call the Aristotelian universe, which is predicated on this idea that there's a transcendent order to nature, either set by nature or by God, and that fulfilling one's task or telos within this natural or divine order is ultimately the purpose of human life. And there's nothing wrong with belonging at the bottom of a natural hierarchy or at the top of a natural hierarchy for that matter, so long as one fulfills that purpose. And while there's a dignity at every level of reality, that does not necessarily mean that the same status or entitlements are granted to people at the bottom as would be granted to people at the top. And over the course of many millennia, this has taken on a wide variety of different forms. In Aristotelianism, obviously, it has a more naturalistic flavor. In Thomism, for example, it has a much more Christian flavor.
Yeah, you'll see this distinction going throughout, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
This idea, and I will definitely tackle this idea. Zizek says that Christianity is an individualizing force inside, relative to paganism, and to a degree that's correct.
Yep.
But Christianity, and this is like in some ways, Islam is a radically like de-theological. It's getting rid of gods, right? But there's a distinct demarcation in all forms of Christianity, from Augustine to Aquinas to C.S. Lewis to Chesterton. This is pretty explicit, which is that you do not manufacture your own meaning and identity for yourself. The meaning is derived from God and your relationship to God. And this is an external thing. The idea that you can recreate your own meaning and morality from your own internal wills and desires is something that is anathema. And I understand that would be the next step in the individuating process, but saying that would be like saying that atheism is the next step to Islam. It's very clearly that Islam only rejects like the non-Allah gods, right? And in the same way, Christianity is individuating to this point. And this is the hard demarcation that separates the religion from basically Gnosticism or something like that.
Sure, but I would argue that a lot of leftists wouldn't actually disagree with this idea that we do not choose our own moral systems by our own accord, right? In fact, the two figures who are probably most associated with this idea that we create our own morality was Friedrich Nietzsche and later on Mussolini, right? For instance, in the 1920s, Mussolini actually appealed to George Orwell and Nietzsche to say that, the great man creates a mythology for himself. And of course, Nietzsche also believed that great men build their own value systems. Now, there are certainly leftists out there, and I'm sure you've encountered them, who would argue that value is purely a subjective thing. But broadly speaking, I would say that the more sophisticated demarcation between the metaphysics of right and the metaphysics of left is this belief in transcendence that many people on the right still have a deep nostalgia for, and that you can still see intimations of in various kinds of Nietzschean social Darwinism, for example, right? The idea that there's a natural order to society that we are to emulate if we are to fulfill our duty and to have a social system that will produce great projects or heroic projects. By contrast, I would argue that what you see on the left is a commitment not to transcendence, but to a transcendental standpoint, which is universalizable. And this can obviously lead to certain forms of subjectivism, but it absolutely needed, right? Immanuel Kant, very famous figure who was deeply enthusiastic about the French Revolution, insisted that it was our primary duty to fulfill the moral law. and was also deeply aware, by the way, of the fact that human beings were fundamentally flawed and often failed to fulfill our moral duty. His famous phrase was, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight is ever made," which I think is...
I would say that Kant is one of the, I mean, he's one of the people that I say is one of the people that tried to fix the Enlightenment. And I think that attempts to fix the Enlightenment have failed, quite frankly.
Well, we can have a discussion about...
Yeah, but I mean, sure. I mean, but I guess once you acknowledge that things are constrained, I don't see what the distinction is. Like, it's just one constraint versus the other, right?
Well, this is the important thing that I think Marx contributes to our understanding of this kind of transcendental viewpoint, right? And we could talk about the relationship of this to Christianity, but there is certainly a genealogical link there, albeit not one that I think you'd be necessarily happy with. But we can get into that later.
Marx is derived from Christianity. That's a core part of reactionary theory.
Oh, absolutely, right. And so, especially Nietzschean reactionary theory and other derivations of it. But let's be clear, right?
No one denies the Christian origins of progressivism.
Okay, sure. So let me just finish. So what you see developing with Kantianism is this notion that human beings are fundamentally flawed and deeply prone to idolizing various forms of heteronomy, and that the basis of virtue and ultimately good is deeply reflecting upon the various forms of transcendental illusion that foist themselves upon us, abstracting away from that and committing yourself to various kinds of universal rules, including the rule that you treat every single person as an end in and of themselves. Now, I ultimately would agree with you that this particular philosophical project ultimately is untenable for a wide variety of different reasons. But you can see how derivations of this is going to persist over a wide variety of different left-wing kinds of streams of thought. So Marxism can also be seen as a very distinctly kind of transcendental philosophy that derives from the Tristan tradition, a deep skepticism of idolatry, particularly various forms of idolatry that are aligned with reifying various forms of power relations, and insisting that under the right political conditions, we will be able to apprehend the world more directly, and we will no longer be prone to these various forms of idolatry any longer. And
my problem with Marxism is its materialism.
Oh, sure. I mean,
stop.
Sure, and I wouldn't doubt that, right? And I mean, one of the things that Terry Eagleton points out is that there's a long history of reactionaries being more attracted to idealism and progressives, broadly speaking, being more attracted to materialism. Now, that's not a firm rule, because I would actually argue that Nietzsche is a materialist of a certain sort, whereas many people, where I'm from, Canada, who identify with the left, belong to a stream of thought called Canadian idealism, very influenced by the thinking of people like Hegel, McPherson, et cetera, et cetera. But aside from all that, right, this transcendental standpoint takes human weakness and human fallibility very seriously and insists that you are never going to get a society where you will straighten the crooked timber of humanity. But nonetheless, it is very important that we treat individuals as ends in themselves, because only by doing so will we establish the social conditions under which people can pursue various derivations on the good life, with the ultimate goal of finding out what the best form of the good life will be over a long period of time.
Yeah, that the political conflict right now is that, I mean, this is what's sort of killing the Enlightenment, is that the visions of the good life are radically diverging.
Sure.
Radically diverging. And multiculturalism probably would have done this, but we don't need to wait around for multiculturalism to do this, because before that happened, the schism in the value system between progressives and non-progressives, and it's really progressives versus non-progressives. There is no conservative ideology. It's a myriad of different ideologies that oppose progressivism. It has become radical. It's become so radical that it's unclear what progressives will even countenance. For instance, this is a very motivating. I was not in response to this video, but this video came out after I kind of did the rehash of your and my conversation on my Substack. ContraPoints released a video.
Was this our first one?
No. This is the one. This is the one that those who walk away from Hogwarts, where I talk about your interaction with Yarvin.
But I wanted to ask. You say you're not a Hogwarts fan or a Potter fan, and you're a millennial. Like, isn't there a small part of you that feels guilty about that? Like, after the whole trans stuff came out, I have to admit I was pretty pissed off because I'm on the left. But there was a small part of me that was like, my fucking childhood just dissolving away.
Well, I mean, I kind of want to. I really didn't like Harry Potter. I mean, I kind of liked it. I kind of accepted it in the spirit it was given. But did you ever read A.S. Bayat's review of Harry Potter?
I don't think so. No.
she just nailed it. I mean, it was in the New York Times in like 2003. I mean, it's just all
they're
of
bad
the interesting.
books,
Well, they're not bad books. They're actually very well written in terms of like the beat storytelling formula. The
really like
problem
the last
is
one
that there's
fucking...
all of the last one is a little bit uneven, but the problem is that the last C.S. Lewis book is uneven as well in terms of beat storytelling, but it's actually quite good for in the Bayat sense. But the Bayat points out the fact that these books are spiritually dead. They don't have any belief in a larger transcendent reality. In the Lord of the Rings, there's all these little magical moments that break through to a greater reality. Think of like Tom Bombadil and the Ents, and there's a few just choice scenes in Mordor that I thought were amazing. And there's none of that in Harry Potter. Everything is just sort of like, it's like you're on an amusement park ride. And they're literally like, the characters are literally going through an institution. They're literally being processed by an institution. The term, like, magic is sold for gold and silver.
Yeah, I know. And also they endorse slavery, which is a really weird thing.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of in a weirdly Aristotelian move, J.K. Rowling rehashes the Aristotelian case for slavery in the fourth Harry Potter book, which is actually fairly based. But not that I think slavery is appropriate for our time, except in specific circumstances. But I mean, yeah, that's the... I don't know. I mean, I was never Harry Potter. I was always defined myself being anti-Harry Potter.
Yeah, I never really liked the books after I hit like 14 or 15. I don't know if I ever told you this. I actually wanted to be a fantasy writer back when I was Catholic. Maybe the fact that I left the church is part of the reason I gave up on that dream. But I was a huge Lord of the Rings fan. And I even came up with my own little fantasy series with everything. But then I ended up reading Nikos Kazantzakis and a bunch of other existential writers, and that was just dropped.
Most people say Kazantzakis is a reactionary.
That could potentially be true. He was a weird guy, though. Like, he went from being a Marxist to a Nietzschean to a Buddhist, then back to Christian orthodoxy. But if you read any of his books, the trace of everything that came before is very clearly there.
Yeah, I mean, the heart of his books is conflict between these visions. So, I mean, that
exactly, or even conflict within Jesus, right? I mean, where else are you going to find
the last temptation of Christ, right? You know,
so, yeah, or Christ be crucified. But back to your central question. I'm sorry to dive off of that.
Yeah. No, it's fine. I mean, the thing is, there's radical divergence of moral visions, and I mean, the ContraPoints video, which was also on Harry Potter. I mean, the conclusion is basically we need to defeat all people with traditional views of the world, and I guess like somehow disenfranchise them from all political power, so that we do not need to engage in a conversation with them at all.
Okay, well, I should say that I don't personally believe in that, and I actually don't think that any deep left-wing thinker would either. So let's take John Stuart Mills, right? John Stuart Mills is a very frequent whipping boy for a wide variety of reactionary figures. Typically, those who want to accuse him of endorsing a hedonistic, calculative ethic that's devoid of any kind of spiritual intonations, and who is ultimately deeply disdainful and even illiberal when it came to conservatism. This was kind of Patrick Deneen's account of Mill in his last book. I think actually what you find in somebody like John Stuart Mill is two things, right? First off, there's a deep appreciation of the importance of reactionary thought in deepening the soul of humankind, particularly by addressing transcendent questions that liberals typically don't. So, for instance, Mill was deeply inspired by Thomas Carlyle and made no secret about that either in his autobiography or in his various writings.
It certainly is easier to read than Carlyle.
Yeah, that's for sure. I had to read Carlyle for my book on the political right, and some of it was quite beautiful, but some of it was a fucking nightmare. I'm not gonna lie. It's
beautiful, but it is. It's like trying to drink a bottle of NyQuil.
Yeah, at points. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Also, my family's Irish, so some of the stuff that he had to say about the Irish got my fucking, my own little residual nationalism boiling a little bit there. But let's put that aside, right? I think that what you see with Mill that reflects the wisdom of the reactionary tradition, while not abiding by its hierarchical worldview, is his commitment to the idea that we shouldn't be hedonic, calculative figures. It is far better to be Socrates dissatisfied than any other human being hedonically satisfied. Better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. But what he draws from this is that even though it's important for us to live the good life, we aren't exactly sure about what form the good life should take. In fact, there are a wide variety of different cultural positions on this, religious positions, and indeed materialist positions. So the best thing to do is to create the parameters for people to run a wide variety of experiments in living, and then draw from that data set what kind of lessons we can use in order to try to lead good lives more effectively ourselves. Now, there are definitely problems with this approach, but anybody who would sit there and say that we have a major liberal socialist figure here who is disdainful of the notion of the good life, I think is just missing the deep resonance of these questions to him.
But I mean, first of all, I mean, I don't think liberalism works without a common concept of the good life. It worked because everyone was kind of sort of Christian. And even when the Irish, and I'm, German Catholic with a little bit of Irish, like that almost destroyed the American project without radical attempts to assimilate Catholics into the fold. This idea that like some kind of this post-Christian. I mean, the thing is, it's like the post-Christian left is essentially calling numerous things that are core values of Christianity anathema to its own moral system. How is this supposed to work? Like, this is we keep on cresting on, right? The idea, I mean, right now, the state is not neutral in this. There's an argument from reactionaries that there can be no morally neutral state, and I kind of agree with that. But if we were to say, okay, let's just resolve this through liberalism, we'd have to divide the education system, we'd have to divide the media systems, we'd have to essentially, I don't know what we would do with half the systems of government. We'd have to completely destroy the Equal Opportunities Commission and just abolish a lot of the civil rights stuff, because inevitably that will be used as a transport for values.
Well, I understand the kind of Schmittian objection that you're making. Actually, I used to write most of my undergraduate work responding to Schmitt in a wide variety of ways. And this is the kind of very brief answer that I'll give to that, right? I think that it is inevitable that any kind of state is going to have to impose a soft vision of the good life on its subjects. There's really no avoiding that, because any coercive system of government is going to have to do so. However, where he makes a mistake is in the totalizing conception of political theology that he adopts and extrapolates everywhere that he can possibly can. I think it's very clear that there are variations in terms of the parameters of permissiveness that are available in a wide variety of different state settings. So let's take the state that he preferred, Nazi Germany, right? It's very, very difficult for everyone, including Catholics, to lead their vision of the good life in Nazi Germany, because there was one extraordinarily totalizing view that was imposed at the threat of death, and not even death, worse than death, really. And that's something that I think we can all agree we don't want to see. Compared to that, liberal democracy definitely has problems in terms of inclusion, and it can have problems with inclusion when it comes to tolerating groups on the left, when it comes to something like McCarthyism, and it can have problems with inclusion when it comes to things on the right. For instance, a lot of the furor right now around things like, is it permissible to force very conservative Christians to bake cakes? My response to this
I'm thinking more like assertions that come from the government that say things like trans women are women, because my employer is not neutral. My employer is not neutral. They say that you cannot say trans women aren't women. Okay, and they've hinted that the fact that they could force you to assert that trans women are women. So now what we have is I mean, they say this because they're pressured by legal statutes implemented through the government that indicate that they could be liable for damages in the event that an employee says something that then an activist group can take. So this is a sneaky way for the government to essentially impose a moral vision. I mean, this is not, I mean, I think we did a thing on Matt Walsh about like trans women.
Oh yeah, good on that.
The thing is about this is like, you misunderstood, like there's two ways to interpret trans women are women, the statement. The first one is as biology, in which case it's flatly false. The second one, which is I think how progressives actually mean it, is a metaphysical statement. But if it's a metaphysical statement, it's completely offensive to virtually all traditional religions and traditional conceptions of family life. And B, the state is literally intervening to punish, like grievously punish traditionalists for even saying this outside of the workplace, because I'm part of several co-ops, and I haven't been canceled. I've been fired from my job. But like these co-ops are entirely comprised of people who've been, not entirely, but like tons of them have been fired. And most of them have been fired for things they've said off of the job. That what happens is, because of social media, activists essentially comb through people they don't like, and then they find their employer and contact them and create a scare campaign. So what? I mean, like this is a metaphysical assertion, and the educational systems are going to teach this. The corporations are going to enforce this religion. It's a religious principle. What is the statement trans women are women, if not a metaphysical religious principle?
Well, I don't really want to dive too much into the metaphysics of gender unless you want to mince the fine details of Judith Butler.
I'm asking what is the state, when the state requires somebody to say trans women are women, what is the state asking a person to do? Well, for me, it sounds similar to saying the body and the Eucharist is literally the body and blood of Christ. The state could not compel me to make that statement, even though it would be offensive to deny it as a Catholic, but it can compel me to say trans women are women.
Well, this is why. Okay, well, let me respond. I'm going to make 2 points to this, right? The first one is I don't think that the state should be compelling speech under any kind of circumstances, except in very specific instantiations of hate speech. And I don't think that anybody would actually deny the legitimacy of that kind of principle, including some reactionaries, because almost every reactionary would accept that there are certain instances where it is permissible to infringe rights to expression in order to preserve something like the common good. So we might just differ upon the details about that.
Well, this is already happening.
Okay, well, let me just finish. So in terms of whether or not I feel people should be compelled in order to gender someone according to their appropriate pronouns, my argument would probably be no. When it comes to an ethical obligation to do so, I would say that that would be the right thing to do. And the reason is that in these kind of circumstances, I don't think the question is necessarily one of metaphysics so much as one of language. Let's use the example that Ben Burgess brings up in his book, right? If I were to have an adopted daughter and I were to introduce her as my daughter, would you sit there and say, no, that is not your daughter, and I refuse to accept that because that is not biologically the case? Or would you sit there and say, that is your daughter, or at the very least, I will acquiesce to your preferential decision about the way you want that designated at this point?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't have a religious principle against adoption, and Christians never have.
Okay.
But if that person said my daughter believes she's God, yeah, I would.
I've met some kids where that.
No, but no, that's literally like you could literally play this game, right? I mean, like, sure, every now and again there are situations in ancient society where people think they're the opposite gender, but a much, much more common thing historically is for people to think they're gods. And if the idea is that I have to affirm someone's self-conception because it's offensive to them otherwise, why can't Caesar just say like I'm God and I'll change the language so that like whoever identifies as a god is a god and you have to affirm I'm a god. And the thing is that like this is not it's not just like you pulled this. First of all, I mean, if my boss's wife is ugly, and that's an objective physical thing, I'll say she's beautiful out of courtesy. First of all, I don't have a religious principle against saying my wife's ugly wife is beautiful. She's not actually ugly, by the way, in case this ever gets out. She's not actually ugly, but like I don't have a religious principle against lying about that. And secondly, I would actually feel different if the boss said like, okay, we're gonna if you don't say this, if you don't assert this as part of a procedural like HR investigation, like your employment could be at risk. That's like then it suddenly becomes quite different.
Okay, well, this is what I was going to say, right? So again, I don't think that the state should be under any circumstances compelling you to say something that you don't believe. Although I do think that adopting that as an ethical norm would be the right thing to do in these kind of circumstances, much as it would be the right thing to characterize my adopted daughter as my daughter if that is what I ask you to do. Especially because it doesn't really cost you very much. But I can understand that if you have absolute objections to this, then you might be willing to die on that hill and have to face the public consequences. But I think that the second thing that I want to bring up is in the event that you're concerned with the way that private government tries to regulate your speech, this is a point where you could actually really appreciate what the left has to offer. So for instance, there's a very robust critique of the influence of private domination on people's habits, including outside of work, that has been leveled against corporations going all the way back to Karl Marx. And that's especially been resuscitated today by people like Liz Anderson. And I would argue that the best way for us all to protect ourselves and for the best way for us all to protect some form of private life from intrusion of something like private government would be to resuscitate unions, to demand that employers' power over us be radically checked, and to insist that they are not allowed to interrogate what people do in their off time and have that bear in any meaningful way on their employment status or benefits or anything else like that. And that would require a very extensive challenge of corporate power in this country and beyond. And I think it's a major struggle that we need to commit ourselves to for the reasons that you seem sensitive to and that I think are absolutely foundational to any kind of just society.
Well, the problem is, Matt, is that this stuff, first of all, I think lest you use arguments against conservatives on me. I do not believe in a firm division between corporations and government. I feel that China has demonstrated China and the United States are moving to a similar form of government, if you've been paying attention. All socialisms turn into corporate conglomerates. All corporate capitalisms eventually become welfare state mixed economies where the government and the corporations are merged together. Power always consolidates. So where you start with a socialism and you go in the corporate direction, or you start with a capitalism and go in the socialist direction, it's all the same managerial pull. My problem right now is that this stuff, like the very institutions that are designed to protect workers and that claim to be workers' rights, and also the government itself, like these are the people who are pushing these cancellation campaigns and who are the biggest proponents of it. So, I mean, the idea, I mean, obviously the solution, I mean, reactionaries are already doing this, is to organize independently from the main sort of managerial institutions that are out there.
Well, I would say that
there is no movement to fight this on the left that's at all meaningful.
Oh, I would say there absolutely is. I mean, if anything, the drive for higher levels of unionization, a reappreciation of workers' rights, and the attempt to check corporate power, including corporate democratic power, are all movements that are trying to achieve something that is very similar to what you're talking about. But I think this is actually a good point where we can talk about what distinguishes left and right. So many right-wingers that I'm familiar with are convinced that ultimately there is going to be an inevitable bifurcation of power that takes place between the few and the many. And that any given society, no matter how well you try to organize it, will ultimately end up with a great deal of power concentrating in the hands of the few at the expense of the many. And that includes within
power
government.
Naturally consolidates, I agree.
Sure. But I think this is a position where the left fundamentally disagrees with the right, both descriptively and from a normative standpoint. And I would also like to point out, and this is Hirschman's point in his book, The Rhetoric of Reaction, that this argument that power concentrates in a few hands at the expense of the many inevitably isn't actually a very good one for the political right, because if that was true, the political right shouldn't actually be concerned about democratization, because democracy is just aristocracy by any other name, right? Maybe a less preferential form of democracy.
I think I can correct your argument there. We don't care about being ruled by aristocrats. We care about being ruled by aristocrats that are unaccountable and invisible and who launder their opinions through democracy.
Okay, sure, but I mean, then there is a meaningful qualitative difference then between democracy and an invisible aristocracy of the sort you're talking about. And I would argue that that meaningful difference is part because citizens do have input into decision making, a very marginal amount in a contemporary Republican democracy. Now, I would argue that is not nearly sufficient, and that we should be taking more efforts to democratize spaces of power and sources of domination, both in this country and more broadly. But that is a meaningful distinction that most progressives will say we can move along this trajectory towards a more egalitarian distribution of power, and that this would actually be valuable because at the root of a lot of possessive anxieties is this deep conviction that human beings are fundamentally flawed and sinful. Allowing power to concentrate in their hands will lead to disastrous results, as we've seen throughout history. And so it is far better for power to be broadly distributed and divided than for it to concentrate. And it is also better for it to be transparently accountable, even to the minimal degree that you see in Republican democracy, than for it to be invisibilized in the way that you're talking about. Now, we can have a discussion about whether
that distributed power would mean ownership. It wouldn't mean democracy, because democracy is manipulative. If you have a centralized media and a centralized information system, then democracy is just this like easily hackable thing.
But I think
like if you gave me control of all avenues of media, like I could have like Nazi lynch mobs outside every communist's house in 3 years.
Sure, and I wouldn't like that. But
well, you wouldn't, right? But like, this is like, oh, don't worry, man. You'll just have like the people will rise up. That's bullshit. If I tell them, more importantly, if I make movies, right, where communists or socialists or whatever or sexual deviants out for your kids, and that's prestige media. That's not like some kind of Fox News thing that only like,
I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing a Warhammer movie from you. I watched a video on that. Yeah. It was a lot of fun. I'm a fantasy fan, not a 40K fan, but still.
Oh yeah, well, 40K is it borrows heavily from history, which means it's reactionary.
Yeah. I have a friend who's a 40K fan, and he always gives me shit for preferring fantasy, but there's just something about Archaon that always appealed to me. Anyway, go on.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Warhammer 40K leans more on the historical stuff. I don't really aware of the the lore specifically. But the thing is, like, progressives are aware of this. Progressives are aware that if I control prestige media and prestige education, like I can modify it. Like, you can just look at the news cycles, especially having to do with COVID. Like, the COVID crisis was not controlled by any external medical metrics. It was controlled by media narrative.
Well, let me interfere in there and just say that this is a point where I actually think most progressives would agree with you, but accentuate the normative emphasis in a very different way. So let's take somebody like Curtis Yarvin, who I know you're a fan of, and you didn't appreciate me being mean to him, right? But he's developed this complicated political theory centered around the cathedral, arguing that we can divide power into this kind of hierarchical structure, moving from the broad swath of people through to the factory, through to what's the next one? The bureaucracy, then up to
the cathedral's the only one that's important. The other stuff is not.
Exactly.
It's a Moscan concept that the left also adopts from Gramsci.
Well,
so there's the common thing, right? The Gramsci adopts it from Moscow as well. Yeah,
exactly, right. So you can see the notion of the cathedral as a derivation of a much older leftist idea that was developed by Antonio Gramsci. And for that matter, that dates all the way back to people like Karl Marx. Or for that matter, you could even look at Thomas Paine, right? That the primary way that institutions replicate themselves, and particularly replicate systems of power, isn't through coercive violence, because coercive violence is inherently a very, very weak form of enforcement, and it almost always breeds discontent. The far more effective way of doing so is to naturalize existent relations of power by implying that they are either inevitable according to some natural law, or the other primary way that Gramsci talked about it is to sublimate them, suggest that they have some kind of deep association with some kind of profound eternal order that we can't deviate from without bringing upon perverse consequences to ourselves. And Gramsci had a wide variety of strategies to try to undermine the influence of hegemonic or hegemony-inducing institutions, whether we're talking about the university or the media or whatever it happens to be. But one of the things that I think differentiates him from somebody like Curtis Yarvin, who's really just doing a discounted version of an older theory, is
it's Burnham. It's Burnham basically mixed with some choice elements of Schmidt.
Sure, exactly, and I'm glad that
Carlyle.
Sure, and I agree. I mean, I think that Yarvin is a third-rate right-wing thinker. He's nowhere on the league of Dostoevsky and Nietzsche.
Okay, great. But I mean, you're not John Rawls, okay? So like, let's
no, that's fair,
right? I mean, like, you're comparing him to like one of the greatest novelists of all time and one of the greatest philosophers of all time. And like, look, there's no great philosopher that like Nietzsche in the modern era that I'm aware of.
No,
period.
Well,
so we're all kind of weird derivations of these things, right?
I would actually argue that Derek Parfit actually was close to the mark. But anyway, that doesn't really matter. He passed away not too long ago. But the point
that's pretty far. But okay, yeah.
Okay, well, on what matters is a titanic accomplishment, a very dry and boring accomplishment, but an accomplishment regardless. But the point that I'm trying to get at is that Gramsci's insistence that we engage in counter-hegemonic struggles had something that Yarvin didn't. Which is a deep understanding of political economy and the way that material forces are a major contributor to the various forms of ideology and hegemony that propagate themselves over the course of society, particularly from the 19th century onward. And I think it's really telling that in Yarvin's telling, and a lot of reactionary telling, something like the factory is a second-tier concern next to culture issues. And this is, again, where we can see a distinction between leftist materialism and rightist idealism really, really kicking in. Because I would actually argue that if you look at the various forms of hegemony that are operative in our society today, they very clearly have a material base to them that is intended to benefit the ruling class and the ruling monetary class of society. A very good example.
In a sense, people will always take power over money.
Sure,
but a good capital thing. You're probably aware of this right-wing bullshit phrase called "get woke, go broke."
Yeah, I see Jordan Peterson tweeting it out all the time.
Bullshit. It's bullshit. Corporations lose billions on woke products. Woke products lose money again and again and again and again. They keep on making them.
Yeah, and they probably will.
If the material like dollar amount, like the money amount, was driving these decisions, we would not see this phenomenon occurring. People would just chase the dollar. What's happening though is that people are chasing favor with the legal regime of the country and with the ruling class of the country. And these people have opinions that are not strictly monetary in nature. They have opinions about how they want the world to work. So people will take billions of dollars of losses for ideological ends. And I think that I'm very satisfied with the fact that the right-wing predictions are just better than the left on this front. There have been millions of dollars lost on idiotic progressive projects that just go nowhere because some kooky, ruling class person decided that he wanted this thing.
Sure, but I mean, there's also been billions of dollars made on woke products. I mean, one of the largest Marvel movies, because I know you love them so much, outside of the Avengers films, was Black Panther. And even Captain Marvel, which was a really mediocre Marvel film and a pretty mediocre franchise overall, especially now, also made $1 billion, right? So we don't need to get into...
No one complained about Black Panther being woke. Black Panther is actually kind of a reactionary movie.
Well, we don't need to...
But it's the people, the ones that people complain about being woke are things like, I can go through, you probably know them, right? Woke woke does not mean like having African characters or movies about Africa in them. It's a specific kind of ideological injection that's inappropriate and that it kind of clangs. I don't like complaining about it because I find the channels that complain about woke culture to be kind of cringe and missing the main point.
Well, I mean, you and I can agree on that. But here, let me just finish, right? So I didn't want to dive into the merits or demerits of woke culture because I think there's a very good progressive critique of woke capitalism that's been articulated since, say, the 1990s, particularly by people like Wendy Brown or Zizek. But we can talk about that later. The question is whether or not material factors or cultural factors have more explanatory power in explaining how it is that ruling elites operate at this point. And there it does have more explanatory power, and there are a few different examples of this. So
only if you expand the definition of material. Is material anything other than dollars, or is it power too?
Oh no, it's the capacity to actually enact one's will through concentrations of economic power associated with those ones of hegemony.
Then I will embrace the material explanation. If you
sure.
So power, then that's true.
Yeah, but I mean,
I think Marxists downplay the amount of power that comes from influence and ideology and religion. And
sure, but I don't even know how that's possible. I mean, ideology is fundamentally a term that entered into the political parlance through Karl Marx. Now, to be fair, there are cruder iterations of ideology theory out there. But back even in the 1990s, when everybody wanted to abandon the term to discourse and other kind of popular post-structuralist flavors of the month, it was the Marxist tradition that stood very firmly by this category of ideology. And people like the Zizek that resurrected for individuals in our generation, millennials, right? And I'd still say that he has the most sophisticated account of how ideology operates right now. But let's talk about like material determinants of concentrations of economic power. Right now, one of the largest employers in the United States isn't actually Walmart or Amazon. It's hedge funds overall, employ about 9 million people.
Your economy has been entirely financialized.
Exactly, right?
It's been financialized through incredibly dishonest means.
It has been. All right, let me give another example, right? So there's a very good study called Affluence and Influence by I believe it's Princeton, but it might not be. It might be Stanford. Scholar, like empirical political science called Martin Gillen's called. And what he determined was that the average citizen in the United States has virtually no say in getting their policy outcomes enacted into law.
Yeah,
but
I definitely agree with that. That's been replicated many times.
Exactly. And he found
for instance,
that
affirmative action is incredibly unpopular. Mass immigration is incredibly unpopular.
Well, actually, mass immigration actually enjoys about 55% if you look at the support, if you look at the latest Pew polls. And that's even higher where I come from in Canada.
And this depends on how you phrase it, too.
That's true.
Yeah, in terms of if you let people understand the net effect of demographic transformation, they will almost always oppose it.
Sure, but I mean,
and that's been replicated as well.
Sure, but let's be very clear here, right? I mean, when it comes to progressive standpoints on things like same-sex marriage, LGBTQ rights, abortion, right? There are consistent majorities that vote in support of them or indicate support for them in the United States. Now, granted, that does depend.
This is a product of media. I could change this in 3 years if you gave me control of media.
Well, maybe, but I mean,
the social issues, the reason why progressives see such success with them is because they're uniformly the opinions, the class that forms the prestige education and the prestige media.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that.
I mean, this is obviously a derivation. If the prestige media went against this stuff, like I said, you're in the position of being able to completely flip this around. The people who have convicted opinions of this stuff are minuscule.
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I mean, let's look at Lawrence v. Texas, right? The famous decision that actually ended the criminalization of sodomy laws in the United States, which is only in the early 2000s, right? Just about 15 years.
These laws were not enforced, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. But 15 years before that, and in their major decision, the Supreme Court actually said that there is no history of tolerating LGBTQ rights in this country. In fact, we can see consistently the very opposite is true. For a long-standing period of time, the default position has been that we do not tolerate LGBTQ lifestyles.
Yeah, it's Bowers versus Hardwick. Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
but I don't see the point, right?
Well, the point that I'm trying to get at is that this was the kind of uphill battle that LGBTQ activists had to fight. They were in a position in Bowers v. Hardwick where the Supreme Court, which is probably the most powerful body in the land right now outside of economic power, said it's common sense that no one accepts this idea that LGBTQ rights should just be tolerated. In fact, we can look back to 1789, and that's about when our laws have said ever since then. In fact, we can even go back further than that to Blackstone and see that that's been true in England. And now, after 20 years,
I don't get your point. I mean, I know the mechanism that this happened. Everyone, like progressives, will admit that how this happened. This happened because like Will and Grace and stuff like this. Like it happened because.
Well, I would also argue that like.
No, I mean, like for instance, I'll give you an example. Like in the 90s, I grew up in California in an incredibly progressive community.
Sure.
Like everybody had very positive opinions about gay people. And everyone had like these incredibly negative opinions about evangelicals, and specifically evangelicals from the South. Like we hated them. And like we never knew a single evangelical, but we thought they were the worst. And I discovered later that like one of my friends was an evangelical Christian. Like he just hid it from us.
Sure,
like, we had no idea what evangelicals believed. We had no idea like who they, all we knew is that on the Daily Show, they were the bad guys.
Sure,
right?
But you lived in a very different kind of community than I did, right? I grew up.
Okay, I'm trying to demonstrate to you, like this impression of evangelicals as being bad was entirely manufactured by media.
Okay,
but and if we had gone from our experience, we would have
let me
the
come up with a
opposite idea.
counterexample, though. I mean, at the very conservative town that I lived in, Stittsville, Ontario, right, one of the most conservative ridings at the time, at least in country of Canada, almost every single person there thought that the decriminalization of same-sex marriage was a very bad thing. And when I talked to almost anybody in my town, including my friends, they said that this is extremely weird and is aberrational in some way, shape, or form. And in fact, when same-sex marriage was decriminalized, including by the Supreme Court in 2004, there were consistent majorities against it. Now, the situation is entirely inverted. But that's only because of decades of struggle on the part of LGBTQ activists to try to change the minds of all the people that I grew up with.
No, that's not true. That's not how it happened.
It is absolutely
no. I guarantee. I mean, unless you're in an incredibly strange situation, like the minds of the people in your very conservative town were not changed because an activist came to their door and talked them out of it.
Well,
it
I mean, that's what happened
because they watched television. No, I mean, changed because they watched television. That's how it. Like, maybe you could think of one, right? But in the overwhelming, like, this is just I don't know. I mean, I think it's just factual. Like, it was changed because they were watching television and movies that displayed this as as a good thing to be for LGBTQ. They warmed on LGBTQ for the exact same reason that at the exact same time, all of my cohort hated evangelicals, despite having no negative experiences with them in their real life.
Okay, well, I can tell you from years engaged in various forms of activism that there are an awful lot of us that went out and had to speak to people just like my friends in order to encourage them to change their mind on a wide variety of issues, right? And in fact, oftentimes the kind of people who would be most open to changing their opinion were exactly those who said, hey, I met someone that came and talked to me, and you know what? They're not that bad. It often wasn't even a very profound ideological shift. It was usually something like, you know what, he seems pretty normal to me. I don't necessarily think this is as bad. Or something like what happened with a lot of my friends. They found someone in their family who came out, and they decided that it was more important to retain that friendship or more important to maintain that family connection than to actually make a hassle out of it. So I have no doubt that changing media diets did help shift people in favor of LGBTQ.
I mean, we're talking about the vast majority.
But let's be okay. For instance, okay, but let's be clear. That only occurred because the activists first had to create the cultural space where even inventing those kinds of programs was considered acceptable, let alone actually broadcasting them to a very wide audience. And that took decades and decades.
So for instance, I'll give you an example of my own family. Like there were like my father's family comes from a place that was the Third Reich. Like they knew Jews and they had good relationships with them. Mm-hmm. Like when the propaganda machine starts in, like that just gets blown. Like they don't think about that. That just gets blown over. Like the Jewish people could. I mean, I don't think that they had very strong relationships, right? Mm-hmm. But like once a propaganda machine starts into place, it doesn't matter if you've got somebody that like you really like.
Okay, but
You
I
know,
mean,
that's just that's just the good one, and the rest of them are all just criminals.
okay, but I
Right?
mean, what
Like
kind of propaganda machine are you talking about, right? The
I'm
centuries
talking
of.
about a modern media propaganda machine where common ideology gets displayed across all your movies and your television shows.
Okay, but I mean, okay, but let's be clear, right? That only was created in a context where they had to struggle against 1,000 or more years of common law legislation that prohibited sodomy, prohibited same-sex relations, decades and decades of judicial decisions at the Supreme Court and at the federal level that said we will not accept this, and a widespread social consensus that saw this as somehow unnatural or aberrant. Now,
I don't see what that has to do with a thesis, right? Like,
no, because it took many years for activists to actually change the cultural landscape in order to make the propagation of those kinds of materials even acceptable to a marginal number of people before it spread out. And I think that that's a real accomplishment. You could even see it as a kind of heroic enterprise. Think about somebody like William Burroughs, right? Who was
okay. I mean, like, let's try this in the opposite direction. Could activists encourage people to get so the marriage rate's way down, right?
Mhm.
This is another thing that kind of flipped my opinion on gay marriage. If you permit me an aside,
Sure.
when I first converted to Christianity, I was a huge progressive. I voted for Barack Obama. I was voting for Barack Obama the first time, and I was like trying to create a progressive version of Christianity. And I was like really into like Andrew Sullivan and like this idea that like
Right.
gay, and so like. And I was like, oh man, the Family Research Council. There's this test that I was like, okay, well, gays can get married now because like most of the people by 2012, this was a fait accompli. The Family Research Council was like a big villain in my imagination. And I thought, okay, well, GLAAD is pro-gay marriage, which means that they have to have a similar opinion to gay marriage that the Family Research Council has about straight marriage. But that's not true at all. The GLAAD doesn't, I mean, the Family Research Council actually cares about marriage. Because, you know how I know that? They care about marriage because they're against divorce and they're for straight people getting married. They're very worried that straight people aren't getting married.
Okay,
Whereas
but I mean,
GLAAD doesn't care about gay people not getting married. It doesn't care about, if gay marriage is a good thing, then de facto gay divorce has to be a bad thing. And no one cares about gay divorce and no one cares about gays not getting married. So by sort of a Solomonic deduction, I can immediately see that no one cares about this. They only care that the institution is sort of redefined.
I don't necessarily think that's true at all. I mean, if anything, I think that it's very clear that one of the reasons that people pushed so hard for gay marriage was twofold, right? One was the desire for recognition on the part of queer couples, which had long been denied them over the course of many millennia. And the second reason is that many queer individuals, including plenty that I know, were very eager to form family units in a very traditional sense, except with the gender.
Okay. So how common is that? Like, is it a problem that it's not common? Is it a problem like if it doesn't occur, if gays don't get married and don't form up sort of more like monogamous couples, is that a problem?
I would actually argue that the most important thing is actually to try to form a family unit, because I do think that people find a great deal of value in forming not necessarily nuclear families, but family structures.
Anything can be called a family. I mean, like, and specifically a formation that the marriage implies, right?
Okay, but let me finish. All right. And I don't necessarily care whether or not people describe that as a marriage. I think that actually, if people want to get married, then they should do so, especially if that would be conducive to them forming that kind of family structure. But I think the most important thing is the degree of attachment that exists between those individuals. And I think it's far more likely that we will see this facilitated in the queer community in the event that we actually tolerate these kinds of relationships. And
have we seen it? It's been like 10 years, right?
I would say so. Yeah. I mean, look at what happened with Dave Rubin not too long ago. Dave Rubin and his husband tried to adopt. No, Dave Rubin and his husband tried to adopt a child. They married.
Oh, but this is an anecdote. I know that like I'm from a blue state. I have tons of people I know, gay people, and a few of them got married, right? But I'm speaking overall. Well, this idea. I mean, the thing is here, Matt, is we're seeing an incredible collapse of marriage generally across the board.
Sure. But I mean, I'd say that the more primary reason for that is actually economic rather than necessarily just cultural. I think that cultural plays a role in it. But let's be clear, right? We live in a condition right now where, because of the vast disparities in economic opportunity that are available to us, it is very difficult for people, particularly in Gen Z and millennials like myself, to form more expansive family units, particularly by having children. And there's reams and reams of social scientific data to back this up, where many people will indicate
No,
that the primary reason.
it's obviously both. It's obviously both, because
So,
the economic commissions.
so
Hold on a second, Matt.
no,
This is a dialogue here.
Okay, but I let you. Yeah, but I let you speak, and I want to finish. Okay, and I think it's very clear that in these kind of circumstances, we can ask what the right way to create more families is. Would the right way to create more families be to prevent queer individuals from forming family units themselves because of social conservative concerns, or would it be to actually change economic situations where people can more easily form family structures and have children if that's what they want? Because I think that we would all agree that that's what we should be doing.
So progressive communities that are rich should be really good at forming family units.
Well, they are. Actually, that's not my conclusion.
They're not.
Actually, that was not my conclusion. That's Charles Murray's conclusion. So
that's not Charles Murray's conclusion. You can adjust this. You can adjust
I mean, this is his book.
Ideology.
This is his book, Coming Apart, right? Where he points out, and this is actually a point that you should bring up, that progressives
I know backwards and forwards, Matt.
Okay, well, this was his point in Coming Apart, so you're familiar with this, right? Where he pointed out that progressive affluent families, who were amongst the first to criticize bourgeois conservative values, are very frequently, according to him, the ones that most live by them. So they will very frequently say things like, everyone should be allowed to do whatever it is they want, we don't care. Whereas those with money and affluence will typically have very solid nuclear families, passing money on intergenerationally, all while being indifferent to the struggle.
But this is that the problem is, Matt, is that the Charles Murray is referring to a very, very small cohort in that example. If you extend it across, and this has been replicated a lot too, you can see that the greatest predictor of, if you just take it across educational backgrounds and money, conservatives and conservatives' traditional behavior attitudes is a huge predictor for marriage, childbearing, and marriage. It's the biggest one. So obviously, like if you're Nancy Pelosi, you have tons of kids. If you're Elon Musk, you have tons of kids. But broadly, if you do a cohort study and do a comparison controlling for wealth and education, the cultural attitude is the biggest predictor.
Sure, but I would say that's not necessarily even conducive to what it is that you would like, right? So take Poland and Hungary right now. These are two societies that have tried to adopt illiberal policies and focus resources to family formation, right? And one of the things that's come out over the last couple of years is that they have been very, very, very bad at that. And the main reason is that even though there is a great deal of cultural weight now placed on forming families, and even though the government has actually tried to offer financial aid to people to form families, for instance, by offering more things like mat leave, which I would approve of, by the way, it seems very, very hard to convince people to do that because there's still not a sufficient economic incentive for them to do that.
Let's go to a good example, not a bad one, right? Because
Berkeley,
California,
this is a good example, right? Because you have socially conservative, illiberal communities that have actually tried very hard to recreate a culture that no longer is present, and that have even offered minimal financial incentives to encourage people to engage in family formation, usually with a xenophobic dimension, and they have failed. They haven't been
we know what encourages people to have families.
So what I would argue is that we need to be more generous, right? Rather than just offering people something like mat leave, like they do in Poland, we could do something like what they do in Italy, which does have a relatively high birth rate, or did.
Italy has a rock bottom birth rate, dude.
Well, it's certainly higher than Hungary's, right, which has a negative birth rate.
There's no such thing as a negative birth rate. What are you talking about?
It had a negative birth rate, I think, until
What is a negative birth rate?
It was losing more people than were actually being reproduced.
That's anything lower than 2.1 is that. And every single country in Europe has a below 2.1. And I believe Italy's was one of the lowest child per women's countries. I'm thinking
back to the early 2000s, right, when I was drawing this
Probably, it might have been different then.
It could be, right? So
there's a great example. I mean, this is something that you've caught me on a point of strength. But you can go to people like Jonathan V. Last, right? The biggest predictor of, first of all, the big problem, the thing that is driving low birth rates right now is that an incredibly few number of people are pairing off. And this is because the dynamics of the sexual marketplace are just shot. Nobody is getting into relationships because how we've organized things in the post-sexual revolution reality. The biggest success of any pronatalism was coming from, according to Jonathan V. Last, was coming from Georgia, which tried to essentially encourage religion again, which works if you can get people to actually attend church. But the thing is that it needs to be essentially a both and operation. We know from the past that people formed families with a lot less money than they do right now. the things that drive, and actually Steve Saylor does a good thing. The main thing that drives family formation is a good sexual marketplace, which we don't have, and which every single social progressive thing is doing to discourage. And B, housing cost. Housing cost needs to get way lower. Now, and also
listen, we can absolutely agree then on those kind of economic baselines, right? And I should also point out that I don't think that any progressive out there would argue that people should not go to church or that there's something bad about going to church. There might be a couple of fringe tankies out there that think religion is inherently a bad thing, but the mainstream consensus is that if people want to form meaningful communities at the local level that are religiously edifying and that are conducive to family formation, that is entirely within their right. And it is actually something that should be encouraged, so long as they don't become homophobic, quite frankly, right?
Okay, I mean, like that's bullshit. No, that's bullshit. You
can't
be like, okay, we want you to go to church, but then we're gonna, but there's an exception where we don't want you to go to church if you believe in things we don't like.
Well, I'm just talking about the kind of mainstream progressive view about this. But I mean, most people would even say that in the event that you form a church and you hold views that are aberrant in some way, shape, or form, that is nonetheless entirely your right to do.
Every single religion that has a positive birth rate has homophobic ideas attached to it at this stage.
Well, I mean, that's a problem, right? Because I don't necessarily agree with that. And I don't think that that's conducive to the kind of family.
And it's a problem for you to explain. I mean, explain why that is to me.
Why it is that other religions have high birth rates?
Explain to me. I mean, this is a good, explain to me why. And this is something that actually God smacked me when I converted to Christianity. I wanted to be a progressive Christian, but I realized very quickly the progressive Christian church, like they have all the best churches. Like they have all, like I went in Seattle, I lived in Seattle, and I walked by all these beautiful stone churches with like Black Lives Matter flags and rainbow flags out of them. They were all empty on Sundays. They were all comprised only of old boomers. And the few conservative churches were full of young people, and they were getting married and they were having kids. The thing is that, I mean, this is a good thing I want progressive Christians to explain this to me. Why do progressive Christians, A, not attend church, and B, not form families?
Well, I don't necessarily think that's true, right? As a member of the Institute for Christian Socialism, I know very, very many Christian socialists who attend church regularly and are heavily involved in their communities and have extensive families, and actually think that that's been very valuable for their life.
But what is, like, first of all, what church is this?
Well, I'm not going to actually name any of the people here because it's not their business, right? But
what church are you a Christian?
Yes, I'm a Tolikian. But
do you believe that Christ like resurrected?
I would argue that I believe in God. I don't necessarily know that I believe in the literal truth of everything that's in the Bible, but then no Christian does believe in the literal truth of everything.
No, do you believe in the Nicene Creed? I'm saying.
Yes, I do.
So you believe Christ physically resurrected then?
I would say so, yes. And I would also argue that I believe in God, or I do believe in God, but it's not necessarily something that I can prove, right? It's a matter of faith.
I'm not asking you to prove it. I mean, no one can prove anything. The only things I've ever seen proven are mathematical concepts. You cannot prove anything.
Kind of logical proofs, but no, I believe in God. Yeah, but it's an article of faith rather than one that is rationally defensible on my point. And I do also adopt a non-chauvinistic view of my religious tradition, because I also tend to think that there are other religious traditions out there that offer things that are of spiritual value to their members, and that there are a variety of different ways, to use Newman's term, to ascend to God. And my goal would be to actually offer people affirmative ways to go about doing that within the parameters of their own religious tradition, accepting the fact that, of course, that they will not necessarily be palatable to me in exactly the same way.
So, but this is what I've discovered, right? What I discovered, and what kind of led me back in the social conservative direction, is that once you say yes to like gay marriage and things that are flatly sort of against Christian morality as plainly stated in the doctrine, you can't say no to anything. Can you tell, like, can a Christian pastor tell a young woman that she shouldn't sleep around? Or that can a Christian pastor tell a young man that he really needs to marry the woman he got pregnant, or that they shouldn't get an abortion, or that they should settle down and have kids as opposed to do whatever, go on a vacation? And the thing is that once the Christian churches that embraced sort of the gay marriage proposition, it wasn't like they embraced the gay marriage proposition and then they told all the straights that they had to have no premarital sex and not use pornography. They just said yes to all of it. They said yes to all of it. They said, like, the people that couldn't say no to gay marriage couldn't say no to pornography either. They couldn't say no to high-speed dating. They couldn't say anything at that point that was a desire from the sexuality point of view had to be endorsed by the church, and
Well,
that led
I would
to
say that
exactly
this
the
is
kind of situation you have now.
This is a difference of emphasis between progressive Christian churches and what we might broadly call reactionary or conservative Christian churches. So let's draw upon the example of many of the people that I know, right? And my own experience for that matter. Generally speaking, what you'll find in progressive Christian churches is an argument that the primary way to express one's faith is through works, right? Particularly those directed towards the wretched of the earth, the poor, the hungry, the suffering, the needy. And this usually has a political dimension to it, where we feel that a just society is one that prioritizes the needs of the least well off, which many Christians would say that we're not doing a particularly good job of now.
Yeah, but you wouldn't give me credit for that, right? Like you have an idea of how society should be run, and I have an idea of how society should run, right? But like, my reactionary views, like that's not a virtue. That's just an opinion.
Sure.
Right? And your socialist views are not a virtue. Like if you go out and like, actually work, that's work. If your opinion is that socialism is good, that's not a work, that's an opinion, right?
Well,
and even promoting your idea of socialism is not work. Like for
Sure,
instance,
sure,
I promote reactionaryism in this channel, but that's not charity. That's
Sure,
just me
but-
promoting my political view, and that's no different than you promoting. So, what I've
Sure. But I mean,
in progressive Christianity, like it has
okay,
to
but
actually work.
let's be clear. I engage in various kinds of charitable activities and have for a very long period of time.
I'm not personally attacking you,
Okay,
but
but
I'm making a distinction here.
So
that, like,
let me
your
just
political
elaborate
opinions are
that position.
Sure.
Right. So you're trying to argue about what is the primary difference between progressive Christianity and reactionary Christianity, and I think that there's a very clear demarcation that we can make here. Right. So the basis of Christianity, as you pointed out, that all reactionaries have accepted, is this idea of equality before the throne of God. Not necessarily equality in this life, but ultimate equality in the transcendent realm. The way that progressive
who accepts that?
I would say argue that most reactionary Christians would actually argue that a fundamental tenet of Christianity is this notion of human equality before the throne of God.
Equality, you're treading lightly, because this is something I remember getting into debates for a while. There is an equality of dignity and equality of God's love. There is not necessarily there's not necessarily an equality in the kingdom of heaven. As a matter of fact, like Christ's own words imply the exact opposite. And numerous Christian mystics, from Dante to Teresa of Avila, said the exact opposite. So we have to tread very, very lightly here. There are some forms of equality, right?
So let me be clear then, because this is what I'm trying to get into, but you keep interrupting me, right? So the distinction between reactionary forms of Christianity and progressive forms of Christianity is over how to interpret this equality, both metaphysical and ultimately political, right? Because reactionaries will certainly insist that equality in the spiritual realm, in the senses that you're talking about, does not denote in any way, shape, or form equality in the human realm, where hierarchy of some sort is going to be the order of the day, and might have been ordained by God. And it doesn't even necessarily need to entail spiritual hierarchy in the next life, right? Because there'll be the stratification that exists within the kingdom of heaven. Progressive Christianity has its roots in two major forces, right? Rather than being influenced by Aristotelianism, progressive Christianity was deeply influenced by the Stoic tradition, which was one of the first that emphasized the fundamental equality of all human beings based upon this notion.
I agree, and I'm agree with the history.
Okay, so
let's get to the.
Okay, so let's get into it then. All right, allow me to finish. And the basis of this kind of egalitarian view of Christianity that eventually emerges and becomes important over the course of the 19th century is, once we recognize the fundamental equality of people in this more meaningful sense, drawn from Stoicism and adapted over the course of many millennia, it becomes very clear that our primary duty shouldn't necessarily be to engage in grand projects or accept hierarchy, but rather to try to create a society where, as Matthew says, the wretched of the earth know that God is on their side. And every progressive Christian from the 19th century onward would argue that the fundamental problem with modern society is that it's very clear that the wretched of the earth don't know that God is on their side, because they don't live in a society that makes that clear. And so down the line, through people like Reinhold Niebuhr, Tillich, or MLK,
sure.
Yeah, the emphasis has always been that the most important kind of work is charitable, yes, but also political. We need to agitate for important structural reforms that will bring society into line with Christian values, and that this will also mean radical transformations in the way things are organized right now. And I think
are my reactionary politics and promoting my reactionary politics a form of charity, in your opinion?
It would really depend on how you understand that, right? I mean, I would argue that various forms of political activism can be a kind of work. Obviously, if you believe that what you're doing is right, then you probably regard it in some senses in that way, as do I, right? However, since we have different opinions about what the appropriate way to instantiate a Christian society should be, and since we have different ideas of what a good Christian society would look like, then naturally we're not going to agree on these kind of points.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what we really disagree with in terms of what Christian society should look like. I mean, our main disagreement is sort of post-sexual revolution, sexual ethics, and family formation. I think the thing is here, I don't know. I mean, like the wretched of the earth. I mean, this is a good question. I mean, what's your? I'm going to kind of switch gears here, but what's your take on how things have been going for the last 50, 60 years in terms of?
Not very well.
Not very. Okay, that's great. I would agree. I mean, I'll put it this way. My mother was born in San Francisco in the 50s, in the mid 50s or mid to late 50s. I was born in California, not in San Francisco, in the mid 80s. My son was born in the 2020s, right? So roughly 30 years apart in each thing. Your ability to raise a family in San Francisco has gone down and down and down, and the safety of being able to raise a family in San Francisco has gone down and down and down. The entire city is now covered in crime and human destitution, the wretched of the earth. Why? Well, and like, you know, it's not Republicans, right? It's not.
Oh, it's not Republicans.
We got rid of Republicans from the state. I mean, but they'll blame Republicans. They'll blame Republicans for why San Francisco looks like a huge dump right now, and
I don't think it's
a family there.
Okay, but I don't ultimately think that it's Republicans' fault, right? I think that given the kind of neoliberal conditions that we've been living on since at least the 1980s, arguably back to the 1970s, it should be no surprise that we've seen these kinds of levels of destitution emerging in progressive states like California, and indeed progressive cities like San Francisco, because the reality is that most movements in this country that label themselves progressive or Democrat aren't actually deeply committed to absolving this country of its deeply sinful attraction to economic inequality. And this is one of the reasons why I think you've seen things like Bernie Sanders emerge, who have been very critical of Democrats, because they don't actually do very much for the constituencies that they claim to care so much about.
So, but by neoliberalism, you mean like NAFTA?
I wouldn't necessarily say NAFTA, no. My understanding of neoliberalism...
What's neoliberalism?
Neoliberalism as the form of governments that emerges in the 1970s and the 1980s that sees it as very important for the market to discipline society rather than for society to be demarcated from the market. That's David Harvey's definition, by the way.
I don't think that there has been a big difference between how. I mean, I think this is sort of over. I mean, there's been a trade liberalization, deunionization a little bit, but the unions were broken mainly because the jobs went overseas.
Well, not a little bit, right? Well, that's part of neoliberalism as well, right? Neoliberalism can't.
Okay, so it is kind of NAFTA then, right?
That's part and parcel of it, but only symptomatic, right? So let me give you an example, and NAFTA is actually a good one that I'll come back to, right? In the 1950s. Trade unionization rates were about 33% in the United States. That was quite high, considerably lower than in some parts of Western Europe, but quite high, right? At this point now, they've gone down to single digits, and they've only upticked over the last couple of years. At the same time, what you've consistently seen since the 1970s and the 1980s has been skyrocketing inequality, generated in no small part by rolling back a lot of the limitations we imposed on the market for good reason in the 1930s as a result of the Great Depression. And also you've seen a lot of the social democratic institutions that were established in order to try to look after the stall off torn down by successive administrations. And I should add, that includes Democrats, right?
And the price of labor basically dropped through the floor during this time, right?
Oh, well,
the price of labor, like the cost of labor, right?
Yeah,
that should be the focus here, right?
Yeah, and that's part of the problem, right? So
there's two things that drive that. One's immigration, the other one's trade.
Well, I would argue that actually what you see in these kind of circumstances is actually the cost of labor declining, not necessarily because of an influx of migrants, but because of a decline in unionization rates. So what you saw...
the influx of vagrants that's a separate issue. That's a crime issue.
No, migrants, right? So what I'm getting at, though, is that throughout the 1950s, up until about the 1970s, what you saw was...
I'm talking about like legal immigration, right? Like,
well, there, through the 1950s, well, actually 38, up until about 1970, you saw real wages for a lot of workers in mostly industrialized sectors, but more broadly across the United States, increase year on year. Part of this was driven by high levels of economic growth, but part of it was also driven by high unionization rates and regulations on exploitative forms of capitalism. Now, this was insufficient relative to what you saw in Western Europe, let alone some of the more robust social democracies like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. But it was definitely a step in the right direction. So just let me finish. And then what ended up happening was an awful lot of that was rolled back, including by Democratic administrations, most notably the Clinton administration. But I would also blame Obama for a lot of that. And
what specific policy is this? What specific policy?
Well, think about what happened with Bill Clinton, right? Bill Clinton doubled down on an awful lot of the Bush-Reagan administration's policies, particularly transitioning welfare to workfare. And he also insisted very famously...
that can't explain it. That was like in the late 90s. We're talking about a collapse in labor stuff that occurred in the 80s.
Well, it's
But
this is what I'm getting at. It's all in continuation of the same process, right? And this is what's
so we have to get labor costs high by basically restricting the number of workers that can essentially be used for capital. There's two ways we can do it: restricting trade and restricting immigration. I think we agree on that, right?
No, I don't think that we agree on that. I think that we might be able to agree on the fact that...
How is increasing the number of workers that capital has access not going to crater the price of labor in the supply and demand sense?
Well, because you have to think about these issues globally, right? I don't just care about workers.
No, but globally, but it's a barrier. Globally, they can't move. Like the globalism, the capital can't move as readily as it wants to. If you restrict the movement of labor, the price of labor will go up in both places because more work will have to be done.
Well, I think that there is an argument to be made for trying to reindustrialize the United States and bring jobs back, right? I don't necessarily think that needs to be associated with declining rates of immigration or taking in less laborers. But let's give an example of what I was talking about, right? The problems with something like NAFTA and why it is that...
Yeah, NAFTA and mass migration are the same policy. It's just moving capital and labor together.
Not necessarily, right? So let's take the United States as a good example, right? So I lived in Mexico for a couple of years, and many people there were deeply critical of NAFTA for a very good reason, right?
I agree.
One of the reasons was that NAFTA, propagated by both the Republican and Democratic administrations, really required Mexico to basically open the doors to a flood of U.S. agricultural products. And initially, this was predicated on the belief that the U.S. would not subsidize agricultural products, and it would compete with Mexican agriculture on a fairly fair basis. And that's not what ended up happening throughout the 1980s and 1990s. What ended up happening, of course, was that the United States continued to provide vast sums of money.
I think we agree on this. So
okay.
So
this is what ended up happening, right? So what ended up happening in Mexico was the agricultural sector collapsed, and a lot of the people who ended up working in Mexican agriculture ended up coming to work in American agriculture, because where else are they going to go, right? That's where all the agricultural jobs are. So I would argue that. So that
who made a killing off it was agribusiness.
Exactly, and agribusiness deserves to be in jail, or many people in agribusiness deserve to be in jail for that reason.
But you see how immigration helps this process out, right?
This is why I don't think that immigration is not ultimately the source of the problem. The source of the problem is a system of global capitalism that moves various problems around without actually resolving them. And one of the ways to actually make everyone better off would have been for the United States to actually compete with Mexico on a relatively equal playing field. And Mexicans could have continued to grow their crops in Mexico, and the United States could have continued to grow crops in the United States. And
what does that actually mean in terms of policy?
What does it mean in policy? It might actually mean, in some circumstances, engaging in something like genuinely free trade, which some progressives actually agree with, right? Including myself in various instances.
So I don't know what that means. Are we going to have tariffs or not?
It depends really on the circumstance, right? I tend to be selective about this and look at context. But I think it's very clear in these kind of circumstances that tariffs on agricultural products imposed by both Canada and the United States have been a disaster for things like third world agriculture. And by the way, there was good empirical evidence at the time that they would be. So I would argue that rather than focusing on something like immigration, which is symptomatic of a broader problem under neoliberal conditions, instead we could talk about trying to create a fairer economic climate where if people don't want to move, they don't have to, because they can get good, well-paying jobs in their country and continue to work on their farms in Mexico or Latin America, rather than coming to the United States and having to be exploited here.
I have no idea what that would be. I mean, this is get rid of. I guess I'm really allergic to these solutions that sound like get rid of capitalism. When essentially we have sort of a very temporal problem with the homelessness stuff. There's some like this Jordan Neely thing, right? Like this is a good example. This is, everyone's complaining about this guy Jordan Neely who got killed in the subway.
Oh, yeah, the homeless man?
Yeah, but I mean, progressives keep on whining about this guy, but they don't really care about people like this. There are 1,000 Jordan Neelys that kill themselves every day in altercations with each other and with the police. The reason why these people are dying is because drugs. Because of untreated mental illness.
Well, I'd say
that's the reason why this is happening, right?
Well, I would say that the reason the homeless are out where they are is because they're homeless, right? And there's no necessary reason for that.
Wait, well, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, this was a person who was homeless, right? And he had nowhere else to go, and he was grifting in the street. And by all accounts, it sounds like he was brutally treated by
No. Like I've worked, let's talk about works here. In Seattle, I worked for several years in a housing first project. Like there are housing for these homeless people. The reason why they don't go in the housing is because the housing tries to restrict their dealing and access to dangerous drugs, where they kill themselves. And the second they try to take these drugs away, these guys leave. Like, okay, well, there is like first of all, the problem is that they shouldn't be in these cities. The reason they're in these cities, they weren't born there. They come there to get drugs, and they come there because they're suffering from untreated mental illnesses by their own volition. And you can make housing for them. They will not use it if you try to take their drugs away.
Well, then that actually might say something about the need to actually remove prohibition, since that is one of the other major disasters that's been inflicted on the United States over the last couple of decades.
You can give them drugs. So kill themselves with the drugs we give them?
I don't necessarily think that we should be giving them drugs. But let's move on to the kind of question of housing, right? The amount of available housing, public housing in the United States, let alone Canada, is vastly disproportionate to the level of need. And I'll give you one good example. In Canada, during the COVID pandemic, there was a real push for people to actually stay indoors for obvious reasons, right? And one of the things that they found out was that there was not nearly enough space to house the volume of Toronto's homeless safely. And so what ended up happening is they were all
distancing, sure.
And so what ended up happening is they were all sent back onto the street, and many of them ended up living in tents, and many of them ended up propagating a virus and exacerbating the conditions that
how about this? How about we just institutionalize these people with mental illnesses and arrest all the drug dealers and throw them in jail?
Well, I don't think that we should institutionalize people with mental illness, because there are a wide variety of different solutions that we can come up with and something like that.
Our solution currently is to have the homeless people kill themselves in drugs in the street.
And I think that I think that everybody would agree that that's a bad thing, right? And I think that there are a variety of different...
But what's the progressive solution for this? The conservative solution, actually, you blame things on Reagan. You can actually blame this one on Reagan. You can blame the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill on Reagan. That's on the House. Not that I feel at all. I mean, I'm serious, right? Like you can take that one and put it in your progressive bag of tricks next time you talk to Ben Shapiro or whatever, right? Like, yeah. So I mean, like,
he and I aren't exactly fun buddies, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, whatever. But I mean, like, this thing, like, someone asked me, like, what if you were Jordan Neely's parent, right? And I always feel very cautious of this because I'm very sensitive to the facts of different cultures. I never like to put myself in the shoes of an African American because it's a different culture from mine, and who knows. But if I imagine what I would want for Jordan Neely, if I was his parent, I'd want him to be sent to a mental institution and forced to be gotten off of drugs. If he wasn't killed by that guy in the subway, he would have gotten killed in a few weeks anyway. He had multiple assaults, and somebody would have hit him back. And in his incredibly degraded health state, it would have stopped his heart. These people are killing themselves with this stuff. Why can't we just institutionalize them and get them off of drugs? Well, they're breaking laws anyway.
Because I don't think that's a long-term solution, right? So about 500,000 Americans have died in the course of the opioid epidemic. And there's a lot of empirical research that suggests the reason why it is that people turn to opioids in the first place, which, by the way, I agree, is a horrible circumstance to find yourself in. I had a friend whose brother died from an opioid overdose. So it's an extraordinary tragedy, right? But the main reason that people turn to this is because of a feeling of hopelessness, which is deeply aligned with feelings of economic and cultural precarity. And so one of the ways that we could try to resolve the opioid pandemic, rather than trying to nip the symptoms, would be going for the root of the problem, building strong communities with good jobs where people have an excess of economic opportunities available to them. And in the event that they are still not able to find a job, there is a robust safety net to catch them that will do everything in its power to try to...
That will take, like, you could drew them. I would agree with that, but that'd take years to do.
It will take.
What are you gonna do about the people now? They're killing themselves.
Well, I would argue that in these kind of circumstances, this is why we need to take action right now, to take the kind of steps that I'm talking about. But ultimately, I don't think that just nipping the symptom in the bud by throwing these people into an institution is actually going to do much to resolve the underpinning spiritual malaise that leads to the opioid epidemic in the first place.
It would save their lives.
Well, in those kind of circumstances, there might be instances where people will need to be treated that way. But I think that a way more effective way of resolving these kind of problems would be something like what happened in Canada, where they developed a needle sharing program in Vancouver that I'm sure you'd be very opposed to.
Why would I be opposed to it?
Oh, it's a needle sharing program in Canada.
Oh, needle sharing program. Well, giving people drugs, you mean?
Yeah. So anyway, what ended up happening...
I've been in Vancouver all the time. That place is a disaster.
It is, yeah. East Van is a very bad place in a lot of ways.
And it's gotten worse. I was there in like 2003, and the area of like the people dying of drugs was like this one neighborhood, and now it's like 10 times as big.
Sure. And I mean, there are a lot of economic reasons for that. I mean, try buying a house in Vancouver. It's impossible, right? It's the most expensive part of the country. But let me be clear.
Yeah,
right?
because because they increased the population of the city like by
but let's
mass
be clear,
immigration, right?
Well, actually, a lot of the people who don't even own houses there. But it's actually a big problem with people actually buying houses and then not actually living there. It's not a problem there.
I feel like there's all of these like really easy solutions that are too right wing to attempt. I mean, if people are
because easy solutions don't because easy solutions don't necessarily resolve systematic, spiritual, and economic problems, right? So let's take the Insight Clinic that I was trying to describe, right? So you've been to East Vancouver, you've seen the kind of rampant drug use that's there, and you've seen the poverty. And I'm glad that stirred some empathy.
It left an impact on me.
Yeah. So the Conservative government tried to close down the Insight needle sharing program there. Early on, I can't remember if it was the late 2000s or early 2010s.
We're about like 7. That's Stephen Harper. We're about 7 years away from that now.
Oh yeah. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because there was an abundance.
Gotten worse, by the way.
It has, yes, but there was an abundance of empirical evidence then, and there's more since then, that actually what the Insight Clinic has had a profoundly beneficial impact, both on the health of the people that use the needle sharing program and also in incentivizing them to get off of drugs. Because what ends up happening is they go, there's a counselor there, and it can direct them to social services in the event that they want to ameliorate or get away from their addiction. And I think that that's a much more humane, compassionate, and
but why isn't it working?
It is working, right? It should be adopted on a far larger scale. Part of the problem, of course, is that these are experimental procedures and experimental institutions that haven't been adopted or implemented very widely because there's still this draconian policy adopted and implemented with regard to drug use. And I don't think
I'm saying, like, in terms of crime generally, we've tried this idea of depolicing or decreasing discretion on police, and our crime rate has skyrocketed since 2020 when we started this process.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say so, right? I mean, if you look at the United States,
I can see the numbers right in front of me.
Yeah, the United States has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, and a vast majority, a vast plurality of people are in there for drug use. But let's take another example.
That's not true.
Let's take another example.
I would urge viewers to view Heather McDonald's research on this. The idea that venial drug use is driving incarceration is not true.
Well, no, not drug use, but drug-related crimes, right?
There you go. Now we're talking, right? Okay, but these drug-related crimes are usually violent crimes.
Okay, well, not necessarily. Possession and distribution are both very, very heavily criminalized. But the example that I was trying to give out was Portugal, right? So I lived in Portugal for quite a long time when I was working for a human rights organization that was focusing on the war in Syria, particularly various kinds of torture. And one of the things that's very interesting about Portugal is it has decriminalized the use of virtually every kind of drug that you can imagine. And some of this led to quite striking moments where I was offered things like cocaine on the street. Bit of a cultural shock there. But what's remarkable about this is by treating drug use as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue, they haven't actually seen a disproportionate number of people become addicted. In fact, addiction rates in many parts of the country have fallen because it is far easier for people to access social services without the stigma of being labeled a criminal attached with that. And it's also the case that many people are able to seek the healthcare that they need in the event that they want to resolve their ongoing addiction.
But
Now,
this
I don't
is
know.
exactly the kind of language that I hear coming from San Francisco.
Well, because maybe it's something they should try to implement there, right?
They have been. I mean, like, what's stopping them?
Well, because again,
I talk to people from the Bay Area. I've been talking.
Well, there's still
there's years every single time they give me the exact same spiel you just give me, and it never gets any better.
Well, then maybe try to implement those policies, right? I don't know very much about.
I think that they have in some sense. I think that Vancouver is an example of them implementing that policy.
Yes, and again, like I said, the Insight Clinic has proven to be quite successful. Now, it's not a cure.
I'm looking at the results overall in Vancouver. You know, that's what I'm looking.
Sure, but I mean, that's again when I was getting back. You were talking about how it is that we can do something in the short term, right? I think that decriminalization and establishing sites like Insight would be a short-term solution and a medium-term solution to part of the problem. But the ongoing spiritual and cultural and economic malaise that leads to the opioid epidemic can only be cured by trying to establish robust communities where people feel like they have opportunities and they don't need to turn to the hopelessness of drugs to find solace. And I think that there is no evidence that we're doing nearly enough in that regard. And I think that in many respects, actually, you and I would have the same ambitions on this front, where we want to see our strong.
About adopting robust communities. But crime is the antithesis to robust communities.
Well, I think that
you can't have. I mean, the San Francisco that my grandmother grew up in was so much more cohesive. Like the social cohesion of this country since the 60s has cratered. No one trusts each other anymore. Why is that?
Sure, but I mean, I think that there are a lot of different reasons for this. I think part of this is because we live, again, in a hyper-competitive society that is defined by a deeply competitive ethic, where the very wealthy in this country don't feel like they have any kind of
capitalism wasn't invented in the 60s, right?
No.
Right?
I mean, but neoliberal capitalism is very much a new thing. So allow me to finish. Okay, this is part of a very interesting study done by Michael Sandel, who's a left-wing Aristotelian, called The Tyranny of Merit. And actually, I think you would agree with part of this because
I don't believe in meritocracy. So
good, yes,
I don't care.
But this is the explanation, and this is why I think you might actually be sympathetic to it, especially because he attacks.
I probably would agree with it.
Yeah, exactly, because he attacks those elite universities that you don't like, right? But one of the things that he points out that's deeply problematic about progressives, and I agree with this, is that many of them, having attended these elite institutions and internalizing their norms, still tend to believe in this kind of meritocratic ethic where the very affluent in any kind of country are purely responsible for reaching their kind of position and consequently know nothing to the people at the bottom. And one of the more dreary results of this, of course, is that the people at the bottom are led to internalize the belief that if the people at the top made it there because they were so good, then the reason they are at the bottom is because they just couldn't cut it.
That's I agree with that. So I'm not. Okay. I don't believe in meritocracy.
Okay.
But I mean, here's the thing: like we have a new epidemic of drugs in the form of pornography and AI generated stuff. Mm-hmm. So what is our approach to that going to be like?
Well, again, this is what I was trying to get at before, right? You're talking about how it is to establish robust communities. And I think that one of the reasons we've seen the corrosion of this kind of community spirit is precisely because of the promulgation of this kind of meritocratic ethic in a wide variety of places, including in nominally progressive communities like San Francisco, right? And I think that that's why you probably haven't seen nearly enough done in order to resolve these problems. But
if I think of the San Francisco, my grandmother, it was way more meritocratic than the philosophy of San Francisco today.
Oh, I wouldn't necessarily say that given the influx of big tech people. But look, I'm very deeply sympathetic to the argument that crime is corrosive to well-functioning communities, right? I lived in Mexico for a long time. It's quite a dangerous place, right? A lack of the rule of law was a very serious detriment to a lot of people around them. But one of the ways that they tried to deal with this was by electing a left-wing mayor in Mexico City. And the city is safer now than it has been for a very long time. And part of the reason for this was, again, the establishment of a wide variety of distributed programs that were intended to get people off the street, get them into jobs, allow them to have access to things like housing and food. Now, it's not a cure-all, right? I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a safe city, certainly compared to, Stittsville, Ontario, where I grew up, conservative or not, but it's way safer than it was in the 1990s, right? And I would like to see similar kinds of programs on a more expansive level adopted virtually in every urban space that we can think of. And coordinated with that should be the abolition of draconian drug laws that treat people like criminals rather than people who have serious health problems, and also the establishment of sites like Insight, where if people do have a problem and they want to resolve it, and I stress they should try to resolve it, they can go get the help they need without stigma.
I think actually pornography is a good example of this because it's more localized. This is essentially a new drug coming on. What is your reaction to this stuff?
Pornography?
And a panoply of other stuff like Tinder and I mean, you wrote an article on this recently about the kind of stuff that's talked about by Louis Perry and Mary Harrington. This is stuff that the Catholic Church has been talking for decades.
Well, I have a very serious problem with the pornographic industry, right? And this is mainly
This is mainly for crack down on it, right?
I think that we should, for a wide variety of different reasons, right? I would want to see it very heavily regulated. I want to see it stop exploiting women. I would definitely like to see women be granted far more economic opportunities so that they wouldn't have to engage in the pornography industry if that's what they want.
We've already done this. It's called OnlyFans, right? The problem with OnlyFans is not that OnlyFans takes like a 20% cut, and it would be fine if it was 10. The problem with OnlyFans is that OnlyFans exists.
Sure, but I mean, this is where
the way to regulate OnlyFans is to shut down OnlyFans.
Sure, but I mean, this is where you and I would differ, right? So, for instance,
why?
Well, let me explain, right? Because I think a problem of pornography as fundamentally problematic because it entails the widespread exploitation of women, particularly, but also men.
But here they're literally doing it themselves, right? They're literally.
Again, okay, so let me finish. And that's what I think the meaningful difference is. I think that if you are being exploited because you are pushed into a position where you have to enter the pornographic industry because you have no other economic opportunities available to you, and you don't think that you can leave it because those industries tend to be very oppressive, then the state should intervene to try to do everything it can to regulate that or even get rid of those industries. But there are circumstances where people might want to engage in sexual expressionism. And in these circumstances, I think that you and I just morally disagree about whether or not that's a bad thing. Because
I'm saying, is it good for people? Or is this healthy? This sort of OnlyFans relationships, even if you're talking about the women who are remunerated from this, which is very rare. Is this a healthy relationship that exists between men and women that has exploded since COVID? I
don't necessarily know if it is healthy. I haven't looked enough into the empirical data on this. However, I would say that there are a wide variety of.
Open your eyes, man. Okay. And it's incredibly obvious that this is unhealthy.
Well, not necessarily. I know a lot of people who actually find sexual expressionism and exhibitionism something that's very conducive to
their individuality. Does it create families?
Some of them do have families, actually. But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Generally, does it create families?
I don't know. I don't know too many people in the sex industry, believe it or not. But look, this is again a situation where I think we need to.
I think you know the answer to these questions, Matt.
No, I do. And this is what I'm trying to say, but you keep interrupting me, right? I think that in these kind of circumstances, in the event that we create situations where people are not compelled to enter the sex industry because they have no other economic opportunity available to them, and people enter it because they are attracted to the prospect of sexual exhibitionism, then the state should not interfere with their right to do so. I myself would not think that that is necessarily the wisest idea, and I certainly would not endorse any of my friends doing so. And if they were to ask me, I would advise against it. However, if that is the choice that they make, and that is something that I am willing to respect. And
even if it's harmful, even if it stops. If everything I'm saying is true about pornography and high-speed dating being a driver of the decline of the formation of families, would you still support it on the rights of it being like liberty?
Yes, absolutely. Not just because of a right to liberty.
Even if it decreases. But Matt, yes. this is a contradiction in your worldview. You're saying I want communities, But then I'm pointing to something that, I've seen evidence, and you can check all these authors. Regnerus would be one of them.
Okay, but
for
no,
the detriment of pornography and the stuff on high-speed dating on this stuff. You can look at OnlyFans and OkCupid's own statistics and see this, right?
Okay, but
you can look at this decrease, like in the Zoomers. They're much less likely to form relationships and to date and even to have sex. And certainly they're less likely to marry and have families. And this goes straight up when all of these social media do-it-yourself stuff comes in. This is not corporate pornography. This is do-it-yourself dating and pornography. You can see it. And you can literally see this technology destroying the creation of the very communities you said were a precursor to us dealing with the drug problem.
Okay, but I mean, this is the thing. I'm not monoprincipled, right? I tend to think that there are a variety of different objectives that a society wants to achieve at any given time, and that we have to try to get the best balance that we possibly can. And I think that liberal socialism does a good job of that. But let's take the example you're giving about OnlyFans, right? We could inhibit people's liberty by preventing them from doing that. But not only would it be opposed to that, because I do believe that people should be allowed to do what they wish, even if I don't necessarily approve with it within a broad parameters. But also, I think that the way that the state would have to do with this would, of course, be to either criminalize or penalize these women, which would generate extraordinary social consequences.
No, you don't. You have to shut down the servers.
Yeah,
no OnlyFans servers. They cancel their stuff.
Well, yeah, but then other companies are going to form worldwide, or they'll create something else.
We shut down. We do this with child pornography. It's very effective. You just take the servers and torpedo it. That's the end.
Well, yeah,
they're not going to create their own servers.
But this is where I get back to the liberty point, right? In these kind of circumstances, I think that we can all agree that
why should liberty take priority over health of the society?
Why should liberty take over priority?
If you're enslaved to drugs and you're enslaved to pornography, you're just as enslaved if you're enslaved to the state.
Because I don't necessarily think that anybody is enslaved to pornography. Pornography addiction does exist. Let's be clear, right? But in these kind of circumstances,
Jordan Neely was enslaved to drugs.
He was, yes. But in these kind of circumstances, again, I also think that people should be allowed to use drugs, because I think that draconian drug laws have proven to be a dramatic failure in terms of both respecting people's individual liberty and in terms of the broader consequences for society. Because the war on drugs has been a calamity for the United States in terms of its high incarceration rates and the $1 billion. Yes, they have been. And so my solution to that is, rather than engaging carceral methods in order to deal with these problems, what we want to do are build robust communities that will inhibit people from accessing drugs in the first place. And like I said, I think that in the event that you do so, this will also inhibit people, particularly women, from entering the pornography industry, because they don't necessarily have any economic imperative to do so. But in instances where they feel that their sexual exhibitionism is something that is important to them, for a variety of different liberal reasons, I don't think that the state should play a role in inhibiting them from doing that. Now, this might actually have ripple effects on people who find this distasteful, and they might find them ugly in some way, shape, or form. And it's well within their right to feel that way. But I don't think that they should be entitled to infringe people's liberty on that basis.
I don't think you have liberty in this regard. The sexual liberty is bullshit. I mean, do you have liberty to abandon your child?
No, but I think that these two things.
So
these two things are extremely different, Dave. I mean, there's absolutely no way that you. No,
what does sex create? It creates children.
Well, not if you use contraception, right? But I don't think that there's no meaningful comparison that you can make between somebody who is abandoning someone who is dependent upon them, probably to death, but at the very least to adoption and inferior state care, and somebody who is engaging in an act of sexual expressivism for a consenting audience that may very well be willing to pay for that, where both parties feel that they get something from this. And I want to.
So I mean, this is the ridiculous thing about this, though, Matt, is this is all a knock-on effect. If the formation of families is stopped by high-speed dating and pornography, which is the trend it's going in, and it's obviously driven by this online stuff, then you are going to see a massive harm to society in the long run.
You think a massive harm to society?
You already have seen it. You've seen it in so many different dimensions.
I'm sorry, I'm just still kind of baffled that you compare abandoning your child to watching internet porn or producing internet porn.
As it's irresponsible in magnitude.
In magnitude, it's not the same thing.
Matt, I kind of find this a little bit ridiculous. You know that this is harmful. We're going to do it, and we're going to allow people to do it, and we're going to allow them to destroy their communities doing it. Sure, a drug user is not. I mean, there's this great speech by Lee Kuan Yew about why he hangs drug dealers. He says if we can hang them 1,000 times, we do it, because when a person gives someone drugs, they're separating them from their family, right?
Mhm.
They're destroying entire families. And that's what this pornography stuff and this OnlyFans stuff is doing. It's preventing families from, it's aborting families. It's preventing families from being created. And if you live in a society that has no families and no community, you already told me what that leads to. It leads to drugs.
Yeah,
Right?
but I mean,
At least people being depressed. And so you are literally creating the back through this appeal to liberty in the case of sexuality. You are literally creating the background conditions that you attributed the instance of people killing themselves in the streets of San Francisco and in Vancouver with drugs. And these cities like Vancouver, they've been preaching this decriminalization for 2 decades now, and it's gotten worse every year.
well, it's getting worse because economic conditions in Vancouver have been getting worse for a very long time, particularly for the lower classes of the city. And that's something, that, I have an awful lot insight into, because a lot of my friends are trying to buy homes there and find it really hard to do so. But look, the point that I'm trying to get at, I think, is very clear, right? There are certain kind of instances where what we should be doing is trying to inhibit people from engaging in harmful behavior to themselves and to their community. And I think that the best way to do that, if at all possible, is non-carceral. And certainly non-punitive. And I think it's very clearly the case, then the drug example that you gave, that the best way to go about doing that is by adopting a combination of non-draconian drug laws like they have in Portugal, and treating drug use as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue.
I'll send them to an insane asylum and not a prison.
Rather like they're trying to do with the Insight Clinic in Vancouver, all of which has a tremendous amount of empirical evidence to back it up that suggests that it works quite well. Now, nothing is perfect, right? As you know.
So we should expect this model to fix the problem imminently.
Not imminently, right? It's a partial fix. The more broad fix is, of course, the changes to economic relations that I talked about before. In the pornography example, right, I've said that I think that the exploitation of women that takes place in the pornographic industry is absolutely atrocious, and we should be doing everything that we can to regulate that and get rid of it if necessary. But I think that
I didn't hear the get rid of it part, but there's one more thing.
Get rid of exploitative forms of pornography, right? But in instances where people want to engage in sexual exhibitionism and where they have a consenting audience that wants to consume that material, I think for both liberal and consequentialist reasons that choice should be respected by the state. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that I personally approve of.
You can see the consequences of consent-based sex ethics everywhere, and they're terrible.
Sure, but I also think that watching an awful lot of TV is desultory.
And I agree.
A tremendous amount of problems when it comes to things like family formation, because I know people who have a very singular addiction to things like television, video games,
and their phones. And
they
should also deal with that as well.
I agree. And I think that we should do so, if at all possible, in a non-coercive way, by trying to inspire people by giving them opportunities to engage in more fulfilling modes of life. And I think that the same would be true in many respects with pornography. But I want to stress again that I know some people who do find sexual exhibitionism edifying and do find that it contributes to their meaningful sense of life, as do the people that consume this. Now, this doesn't make sense to me because it's not necessary. Who cares? Well, the people who want to participate, the people who participate in it do. Right? Are you going to sit there and go and tell them that you think that what they're doing is wrong, and that you would justify?
I will tell them that. I will,
and that you would justify the use.
I will literally come and tell them that. Yes, I will.
Okay, well, then they'll probably tell you that you can fuck off, and they'd be right to do so.
Yeah. Okay, but
this is again.
This society will. I mean, this is the thing. Well, they'll tell me to fuck off if I'm not wielding state power.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. But this is why I think that we shouldn't actually allow people to exercise state power in order to inhibit these kind of activities.
Much like destroying themselves, I don't see why.
Why not? Well,
I mean, like this is the thing. I mean, you're letting people destroy their entire lives with drugs and pornography.
Well, why? I mean,
this is like we are in the middle of a health crisis, obesity, decline in families. It's all part of the same thing.
Okay, but I mean, you're talking about drugs and pornography, right? You consider pornography harmful to individuals, right? There are many circumstances where
I consider pornography to be harmful to collectives.
You consider pornography to be harmful to collectives, okay?
That is the main concern, yes. The collective effect. Look, I knew somebody in high school who could do heroin, and he did it once and walked away.
Is that
but
true?
Most people are not like that, right? Most people,
that takes a pretty strong willpower, I will say that.
No, but like this is how it works with everything, right? There are some people who can do it and they're fine, and there's some people who can not handle it. And the law exists to protect the people who are the weakest. And if you just flow the doors open and say like, oh, just try this stuff once, and whoever makes it through, I mean, that's the most cruel form of meritocracy I could ever think of.
Well, I mean, I don't think so, right? Because I don't think this has anything necessarily to do in the circumstances I described with economic gain exclusively, at the very least, right? Because a lot of these people are doing this because they get some kind of personal gratification from it, as do the people that consume it, and they see it as part and parcel.
Yeah,
as part and parcel
drugs,
of,
right?
Yeah, as part and parcel of their overall acclaim. Yes, and in this kind of circumstances, again, I don't necessarily approve of taking a draconian line on drug use. I think that there are various forms of drug use that can actually be conducive to people leading a good life. For instance, various kinds of spiritual rituals. But let's not.
Yeah, I have one last thing on my list. I know I'm have you over time. The last thing I have on my list is the thing that I think is the biggest problem for economics. I knew you would go for economics: inflation.
Oh, inflation? Yeah. God knows we're all living through that right now.
Oh yeah, and if you have a family, you're living through it doubly.
Yeah, I know. Fucking right now, my fucking salary can barely afford to keep a roof over our head. It's awful.
It seems to me that the problem with this is decades of irresponsible monetary policy through the Federal Reserve. I'm kind of curious about this on the left. Are you guys like down for getting rid of this fractional reserve like banking?
You mean, do we want to change the way that the banking system operates in this country?
Yeah, stop. Yeah, essentially. And
yeah.
Obviously, if I were a dictator, I'd nationalize the banks and throw these guys in jail.
Yeah, actually, and I can think of an awful lot of people that would be very sympathetic to that on the left, right? I mean, I would argue that the broad left-wing position on this is a Marxian one, which is that absolutely regulating finance or potentially even nationalizing it would be the right solution to dealing with a lot of the contradictions in capitalism that emerge because of speculation on the financial market. However, right?
But if you keep on printing money, like I don't care if the banks are nationalized and they keep on printing money.
Oh, absolutely.
They'll just do the same thing, except it'll go to the Department of Banks.
Yeah, exactly, right. And this is why most leftists would say that that's only a kind of partial fix to the overarching problem, because the major root of a lot of the forms of economic disparity and economic contradictions that we experience right now doesn't lie exclusively in the finance sector. It also lies in the realm of production and in the realm of consumption, and that these all need to be understood as part of the same dialectical totality. And so the argument that most leftists would make is that if you deal with a problem in the finance sector and you're able to regulate it in order to tame or chasten some of the contradictions of capitalism that emerge, that could be a good thing as a partial fix. But ultimately, the only way to overcome the problems of capitalism is to overcome capitalism. Now, how we should go about doing that is, of course...
Yeah, this is like the meaningless statement to me, right? Like,
well, I mean, I can get into some details about what I think would be entailed by that, but
what would be entailed by overthrowing capitalism, since you brought up, like, we nationalize all businesses?
No, I mean, the model of liberal socialism that I adopt is a kind of market socialism that is centered around things like workplace cooperatives or workplace sites with high levels of unionization and co-determination, right? And in these kind of circumstances, what I would hope, and what there's some empirical evidence to suggest, is that there would be a higher return to workers than what you see under contemporary social conditions. The hope would be that this would facilitate a surge in consumer demand, which would in turn lead to levels of economic growth of the sort that you saw throughout the mid-century in the United States and indeed in much of the developed world. There are problems.
I mean, I think that distributed ownership can work in some cases, but distributed management just can't.
Sure, but I mean, that's a technical issue that we can talk about some other time if you want, right?
Yeah, I know the question I was going to give you, actually, to kind of top it off, and maybe you could answer this. This is one of the same with how you deal with capitalism. There is this line, and I know I have you over time, so I'm trying to wrap this up.
Well, it's okay. We can take a little more time if you want.
So
I will say,
Yeah,
I will say we got a little testy there, so I'm sure you have a lot of other things that you want to ask. If you want to ask, let's say 20 minutes. If you want to ask 20 minutes worth of questions, I'll do that.
Okay, sure. But there's this line. You wrote an article about kind of like, I don't know if you're really writing about my school or not, but kind of, where you're like, the what was it? The postmodern reactionaries are going to play softball with corporations and banks. and the malfeasant entities and
I mean, I don't remember
as
writing
a
anything
right
like
winger,
that.
that line haunts me. It
What,
haunts me to
what
think
was the
that the right wingers are going to play softball with their corporate enemies. So I thought it was an interesting example. I mean, we come to like a number of villains: banks, BlackRock buying up houses, restricting the housing market, neoliberalism, drug dealers, pornographers. How would if you were made king, how would you deal with these problems?
How would I deal with these problems? Well, my own
Yeah.
philosophy, as I indicated, was a kind of liberal socialism, right? Very, very indebted to the work of people like Paul Tillich, John Rawls, and for that matter, also Reinhold Niebuhr, as well as the kind of broader Christian socialist movement in the United States. And again, I don't think that this is necessarily a utopian vision of the sort that many people would be critical of when it comes to things like idealist Marxism, because I don't think that any kind of utopia is possible. What I do think is possible is the attainment of a more just society than we live in right now, where it is possible for almost every individual to at least have the option available to them to lead a life of relative or comparative flourishing relative to, compared to what we have right now. And so some of the reforms that I would want to undertake very quickly would be the kind of liberal forms that I talked about before. So, for instance, ending the war on drugs, adopting a more liberal attitude towards drug use, but accompanying that with the treatment of drug use as a health problem. That would be resolved through the implementation of a universal healthcare system modeled off of what we have in probably the United Kingdom or Canada, but I'm a little bit flexible on that. At the same time, what I'd like to see is for people to adopt new kinds of regulation, like what you see in France, that is conducive to the formation of worker co-ops. The Mondragon Corps would be a good example of this, because I do think that in worker co-ops, what you see is the formation of local communities of the sort that you should cherish at the economic level, and you see a higher return to workers in these kind of contexts than what you see in other kinds of economic organization. Now, accompanying this, we can also experiment with various forms of co-determination models, like what you see in Germany,
Sure.
where workers have a say with what's going on in the management of their company.
Yeah, that's where you're going to immediately encounter problems.
Well, I don't necessarily know that.
Collective management will never work.
Well, I don't necessarily know that. Co-determination has been very successful in Germany since it was implemented, including by center-right governments in the 1950s. And the German auto sector is one of the most competitive in the entire world. And auto workers tend to receive higher wages in Germany than they do elsewhere. But anyway, I don't want to get bogged down in the details, right? This is just one.
The thing here is that I think there's a few anthropological, like there's a sort of physics of power difference here. Mm-hmm. First of all, your model seems to completely exclude what seems to be in personal experience and through anthropological evidence to be obvious, that humans will elect for their own self-destruction if they encounter a pleasure, the right kind of pleasure, right? That they will literally destroy themselves, and they will choose to do that. They will electively destroy themselves in the right circumstances. The second one is that collective decision making can work, period, basically. And I'd say that the third one is sort of an anthropology of democracy. I mean, the law teaches, I should say, and I don't understand how people are going to not use drugs if they're bought by the government and given to them. If everyone's just offered drugs all the time, there's going to be a huge section that just uses them and dies.
Well, I don't necessarily think that the government should be in the business of actually giving people drugs. There are certain circumstances where that might be permissible, like the Insight Clinic, where there's rampant drug use, and it's better for people to use drugs that are safe and do so in a safe environment where they have access to psychiatric and medical care in the event that they want to stop using.
While they're using drugs? So the solution is to wait for them to stop using drugs?
Yes, unfortunately, right? I mean, as you know, addiction is a very serious health problem, right? It's not something that can be solved.
If these people were your children, would you give them drugs? Like if Jordan Neely, like the question that was posed to me by a progressive, if Jordan Neely was your kid, would you like give them drugs until they stopped?
No, I wouldn't, because I'm not a medical professional, and I'm not in a position where I can actually make the judgment call about whether or not that is conducive to their overall health, or whether that might be necessary as a kind of transient a transient effort in order to ultimately wean them off of it without actually causing them long-term damage, right? So I don't want to get into
but that's like I'm not saying like you're worried about them, like you're weaning it off. Is the only drugs they give them in a mode of weaning them off, or do they give them drugs?
Well, in many circumstances, they don't actually give them drugs, right? So the Insight Clinic isn't a place that you go to in order to get heroin, right? What you go to the Insight Clinic for is in order to use heroin with sterilized needles that are provided for you by the clinic, right?
Okay, but they don't just give you sterilized needles if they're weaning you off.
Well, but this is the intention, right? So that you'll end up using in a safe environment, and then they have nurse practitioners available and social workers and various other community workers, so that in the event that you want to stop using drugs, you can turn to one of these people, indicate that that's what it is that you intend to do, and then get transferred over to the health system, where they will do their best in order to try to wean you off of that for a long period of time. And I'd like to point out
that just seems like absolute, like no one would, if these were our children, no one would do this. We just take the drugs away from them.
Well, I mean, in those kind of instances, what might end up happening is just what you probably expect. They might leave your family and end up winding up in a community where the only option available to them is order to deal drugs, and then they'll end up being thrown in jail, and then they'll come back out, and because recidivism rates are high, they'll end
or they could be thrown into an institution where we just take the drugs away.
Well, you know, an institution that is a hospital, not necessarily a mental asylum, right? And in these kind of circumstances,
it's a place where you can't leave and do more drugs. That's the difference.
Well, I think, again, it depends really upon what medical expertise says in these kind of instances. But again, I'd like to stress that the Insight Clinic and the point of it is to allow people to access the healthcare system, which is publicly funded in Canada, by the way, I should say, which also makes it easier in order for them to... Sorry, what were you going to say?
So I know. I mean, it's amazing what the Canadian healthcare system promotes. I have priest friends in Canada. They're pushing suicide on people for ridiculous things, for chronic illnesses.
Oh, you're talking about the euthanasia programs?
Oh yeah.
Well,
I have priests that work, with the anointment of the sick, and I hear horror stories about this.
Well, let's stick to the topic that we were on before, right? Because you were asking me what my vision of society is before we got onto drugs, and now we're getting onto euthanasia,
sure.
Right? So I'd like to maintain the through line, particularly because we don't have an awful lot of time available to us. Mm-hmm. If you want to talk about euthanasia, that's an entirely different conversation, right?
I see this as related.
They are related, right? But again, we can't cover every single issue unless you want to stay here until 3 o'clock in the morning, which I'm presuming you don't. So let's move on, right? So let's take your first and second point, right? The first one about the possibility or the prospect of collective management of economic firms. And the second one, whether or not that would actually be conducive to the benefit of workers. I believe those are your 2 points, right?
Well, okay. My point is that people need to be taught through force and example that collective decision making is if it's done in an election, it's controlled by the media and media perceptions. If you give me control of the media, I'll give you the election.
Okay.
And secondly, and this is more important, and this is something that I taught. I was taught to me in the co-ops of Ann Arbor, Michigan. If you put people in a voting environment where they're arguing over money, this is not going to be some kind of collective decision. It'll be a recriminating struggle session.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
There's an awful lot of reasons to discredit each other. Democracy does not work the way that socialists describe it. It's a very ineffective system.
Well, I don't think that socialists describe it in any kind of utopian fashion, except in very rare instances, right? So let's be clear, right? The major argument that socialists give for why it is that we want to democratize the economy is both that would be conducive to the well-being of the people who are least well off in society right now. And the second argument is one that you should be able to appreciate, which is that concentrations of power, including concentrations of economic power, are always extremely dangerous, because allowing concentrations of power allows individuals who are inherently sinful and flawed to be able to exercise domination, illegitimate forms of domination over wide swath of the population.
It depends on what you mean here, right? Because distributing economics would be like everyone gets a house. Like a democratically run housing department is not a distribution of power. That is a centralization of power.
Oh, but I'm a market socialist. I don't believe in centralizing economic decisions, right? So allow me again to finish by talking about my conception of how it is that we can democratize the firm, right? So I think that one of the major forms of power concentrating in our society right now is in the hands of economic elites who are able to dictate vast amounts of how it is that vast swaths of how it is that their employees live, and for that matter are able to dictate through the kind of things that they do a lot of how it is that consumers operate as well. And I think that one of the ways that we can nip this power in the bud, including the corrupting influence it has, is through trying to create more democratic or horizontal power structures within the workplace. And there are certainly models that have proven successful in doing that, right? One of the most clear examples.
I don't agree, but you know.
Well, I mean, one of the most clear examples that I can think of again is co-determination in Germany, which was implemented with the help of right-wing Christian democratic parties. And the SPD, of course, right? So in co-determination, workers have a significant say in how it is that auto companies are run. Auto industries in Germany are highly competitive, and it's also seen far higher returns in terms of the wages and benefits enjoyed by workers. And workers have also indicated in these kind of circumstances that they feel like they are more involved in decision making, and that there's a sense of local community and trust between owners and between workers that doesn't exist in other kind of circumstances. So that's
realistically, though, Matt, what decision making is like? I worked at a semiconductor manufacturing plant for 3 years. What decision? If I were to vote on the decisions the CEO made about what kind of chips the plant made, how the hell would I have the information to make that decision?
Well, I mean, the co-determination model, what ends up happening is you don't directly vote on it, although there are circumstances like in the Mondragon score where that might be possible. But what ends up happening is you vote for representatives.
Mondragon is worker-owned, it's not worker-managed.
Oh, it's not worker-managed, no, but they do have input into decision-making through a wide variety of different mechanisms.
In a very limited sense.
Yes, in a limited sense, but I mean, it's definitely more input than you would get in a traditional capitalist firm where you'd have almost no say, right? But the way that co-determination works, and it works very effectively, I should add, is you typically vote for your representatives who will go speak on behalf of workers on the boards of major firms, and they have to be consulted and they have to agree to any kind of changes that the company is going to implement. And not only is this conducive to worker satisfaction, but there's some evidence that it actually facilitates innovation within these firms, because workers are able to give some insight into how it is that you build something like a car to CEOs who probably don't have much practical experience with those kind of things.
No, but man, there's a process for filtering innovative ideas up through a factory. I mean, how is innovation? Yeah, I mean, I worked in a privately owned factory for years, and that's something we did all the time, right?
Sure,
I mean,
but
I mean, you know.
Sure, but I mean, in these circumstances, though, the process is highly formalized, right? Because in these circumstances, and I'm sure you would agree with that, you often have CEOs who have very little understanding of the tangible mechanics of building something like a car, because that's not what they're trained to do, which isn't to say that they aren't trained to do useful things, but that's not it.
CEOs listen to their engineers who tell them that, right?
They listen to their engineers, right? But not necessarily to their workers who have much more on the ground experience with actually building things like cars. And this is why co-determination can be very valuable, right? Because you have workers who will elect representatives that will go sit on boards, and they have actual experience with constructing things like cars. And doing so day in and day out. And so they can give CEOs and other firm managers insight into this process that wouldn't necessarily be available to them, or certainly not to the same degree. I
think this is an inefficient way of doing things. The way you get information to people is not voting on representatives, because that introduces politics into it. Well, what you have representatives of the expertise areas and stakeholders talk to the CEO directly about their area of expertise. The CEO's role is to make a decision. It's to make a decision point and weigh the evidence. It's very instinctual. It's actually quite. I highly disagree with this idea that Yarvin has that CEOs are like kings. Very much. Yeah. It's a huge.
You don't want like Emperor Elon Musk ruling over the world.
But there is a kernel of truth, and the kernel of truth is that decisions of leadership are fast and highly instinctive and highly developed on intuition. And this is one reason why all corporations take a monarchical form. Is because if you had decision making by committee, there could never be a snap decision, and everything would be political. If you voted on the kind of chip to make it a chip plant, nothing would. First of all, it would never match what the market needed, because it would all be politicized by what the workers wanted to build, which would largely be concerned on their own individual areas. And second of all, it would never move fast enough.
Well,
the
I mean, that's
information couldn't get
okay,
through fast enough.
but that's not the case in these kind of co-determination models, right? If anything, information moves upwards in a way that seems more efficient than in traditionally managed firms. And not only that, there seems to be some evidence as well that workers feel incentivized to work harder in these kind of circumstances because they have a stake in the success of the country that goes beyond the company that goes beyond just I don't want to lose my job, because in the event that the firm ends up profiting, they end up profiting because they have a certain amount of clout so that they can demand a return in terms of the profits of the company that will be seen in their salary. So there are a lot of good things that we can see in the co-determination model, which again, I want to stress seems very functional because the German automotive industry is one of the most competitive in the world and also comparatively very democratic, right? German cars, as we all know, are the envy of many people across the globe, right?
Well, I'll say this, Matt. Like this is different than the drugs and pornography thing or the religious thing. I don't have a principled objection with this.
I'm glad.
Right? Like, if it works, do it. And I'm certainly no fan of the corporate form.
I'm glad to hear that.
But this goes against every single microcosmic instinct I have about how groups of humans behave. Groups of humans behave the best when there's a clear delineation of who makes the decision and a clear understanding of who made the decision.
Sure, but I mean, I don't think that even
anarchists
I don't even think that anarchists would disagree with you. Take anarcho-communists, right? Anarcho-communists are committed to the idea that you might need to form transient hierarchies because they understand the importance of centralized decision making for certain large-scale forms of policy questions, large-scale policy questions. However, they think that political power needs to be accountable, and any kind of hierarchy that formed necessarily needs to be fluid, right? And in the event that it doesn't seem to be particularly functional for the people who are part of the hierarchy, it can be dissolved and replaced by one that is more functional. Now, I think there are limitations to this, right? Because we can't just have people dissolving and replacing hierarchies willy-nilly, because that would be highly inefficient. Right. But I don't think that the fundamental disagreement between left and right is between whether or not we need someone or somebody making decisions. It's about the forms of accountability that are present in hierarchical structures and whether or not centralizing power in the hand of, as you put it, an invisible aristocracy or allowing power to be distributed in a democratic fashion is more conducive to that end.
Distributed in terms of ownership, I'm good with. But Matt, though, I have to answer super chats, but if there was a single type of person, like the last person that I would look to how to build a good community, it would be anarcho-communists. Have you seen the kind of communities those guys build? They suck.
Well, yeah, and I'm not an anarcho-communist, right? I'm a liberal socialist, right? My model for an ideal society would be something like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, which right now are amongst the most prosperous human societies on earth, except because I figure you're going to sit there and press me on this, with more worker input into decisions. So, for instance, in the 1970s, one of the major proposals that were put forward, the Meidner Plan, held that we can actually transition to worker ownership of major firms by essentially granting workers stock in their company. And over a long period of time, they'll become majority shareholders in the place that they work. I think that that would be a great thing to experiment with over time because it would allow us to essentially retain corporate structures of the sort that you think are necessary to efficient production, which very well may be true, but allow them ultimately to be governed and work to the benefit of the people who actually work there. And it's a shame that this plan was never carried through to full implementation. It was eventually canceled in the 1990s. But there's reason to think that it might.
There's lots of like stock options plans out there. I have to get to the super chats here. Creeper Weirdo says, to the good professor, where on the left is room for straight white Christian men? This group is in the left's view must be removed. So how can I still be me and on the left?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm a straight white Christian man, right? I feel pretty comfortable there, right? I think that the concern that a lot of people have is whether or not their reactionary views would be tolerated on the left. And I mean, in these kind of circumstances, I would say that it really depends, right? First off, if you were reactionary, then you probably wouldn't want to go into left-wing circles because obviously people are going to be critical of what you believe. If you, though, were open-minded and you felt that you wanted to move in a progressive direction and you wanted to have a conversation about certain kind of reactionary viewpoints that you might happen to have, then I think that a lot of people would welcome you as long as you're willing to have that dialogue in good faith, to listen, and to express your viewpoint with a collegial disposition.
This is the exact opposite of my experience. The right is open for conversation. The left simply is not.
Well, I mean,
I'm all my experiences with this. The right is not hunting down people who have divergent left-wing opinions.
Well, it could be,
this
but
is
I
not,
mean,
maybe this is the world in the 50s, maybe that might
okay,
be
but
like
I mean, Dave,
but like it's not the world we live in right now.
Okay, but I mean, Dave, you invited me to come on here, right? I mean, let's be clear about this, right? I didn't solicit coming on here. You asked me to come, and I did because you said you want me to speak to the right, and I would say that there are an awful lot of people out there like me, right? In fact, I know that there are because I'm friends with them and colleagues with them. Now, it could be that your experience with progressives growing up in California is a little bit different than mine, but from the sounds of it, I don't actually think they're particularly progressive, right? If you're talking about tech bros in San Francisco,
I'm talking about your average, like what people used to call SJWs, what people now sometimes call wokies.
Sure. And I mean, a lot of them probably vote for the Democratic Party, but you wouldn't necessarily see them voting for someone like Bernie Sanders, right? Maybe they do.
Oh, no, that's the popular candidate. That and AOC.
Oh, AOC. Well, I love AOC, right? But the point that I'm trying but the point I'm trying to get at, though, is that there are many people on the left who are certainly be open to dialoguing with people and to try to convince you that our way of doing things is the right way of doing things, and that will be more beneficial to people like the person who asked this question. I think that the most important thing, though, is, and this comes from personal experience, in a lot of circumstances, what happens when right-wingers engage with left-wingers is they're not particularly interested in dialoguing. So, for instance, the last time that you and I chatted, I received an influx of emails from people being like, go die, go this, strange number of people with U-boat imagery associated with it. That's not a particularly comfortable consequence of our conversation, right? And so I think that in the event that we want to have a dialogue, then it needs to be done on a basis that is going to be.
I mean, the problem with this, Matt, is not that. I mean, like, I'm not worried that. I mean, I get someone sending me an angry email. I'm worried that people are going to report me to my job and get me fired for things I say on the internet. And like, you mentioned President Sunday. He's literally gotten people fired for their political. Yeah, he has. Including one of my good friends. I mean, it's like these people. This is what people like President Sunday do. They go around and they get people fired for things they say on the internet.
Sure.
I mean, like, I'm sorry you got a picture of a U-boat in your email, but that's not the world. We live in the world where we're threatened by impoverishment for un-PC things people say on the internet.
No. But what I'm talking about, though, is very clearly not that, right? What I'm talking about is the fact that oftentimes when people want to initiate these dialogues, it comes with very serious consequences with people who want to engage in them, right? Which includes me being harassed, called all kinds of negative things, dealing with people saying truly atrocious things, I should point out, about my wife and family, right? And that's not an incentive to engage in any kind of constructive dialogue with the right, because I don't want to have to deal with all that kind of stuff, right? So in the event that reactionaries or conservatives want to have a dialogue about why it is that they should join the left, encouraging your community to refrain from those kinds of behaviors would probably be a conducive first step. And on the broader point about what you're talking about, cancel culture.
I mean, Matt, people are getting fired for their opinions online. You're going to have to angry people. What do you want me to tell you? Like, this has got to start with this whole cancel stuff that's going on in corporations that's being driven by the left.
Sure.
The right is not driving this.
Sure, but I mean, let's talk about our own conversation, right? I mean, you've indicated that you think that many queer individuals who are trying to live their lives as quietly and as privately as possible are engaged in some kind of
quietly as possible.
In many circumstances, yes, are engaged in an act of sexual perversion, and that if you could, you would use the state in order to prevent them from doing so, right? I mean, you have to accept that people are going to get really angry and really frustrated when you're threatening them with those kinds of actions, right? Now, maybe you think that's legitimate, but you shouldn't be surprised.
What actions have I I remember recommending things against drug dealers in this conversation. Is that what you're referring to? Or people who sell pornography?
Yes, and you also indicated that you don't necessarily approve of things like, not necessarily gay marriage, but the gay lifestyle or the queer lifestyle broadly. Or I've seen other videos.
I don't approve of most not deviant sexual activity from the Catholic, from sort of the theology of the body type stuff. I mean, tell me what.
Okay, so there you go. I mean, if you characterize something as a deviant sex act that you do not approve of, and you regard these individuals who are, again, trying to live their life as somehow perverse, then you can't necessarily expect them to come in and want to engage in good faith with you, because they're naturally going to feel threatened in much the same way as you just described yourself feeling threatened.
They call me names, I call them. I mean, like, look, Matt, like, this is a mutual thing. Like, the idea that, like, this is being driven by the right, like, you're saying that, like, because I have a position that homosexuality is wrong, or premarital sex, for instance, right? So I have the position I expressed most thoroughly on this program was an opposition to pornography and pornography use. So that position in itself is an assault on pornography users, and they have a right to be angry at me.
Yes, in some circumstances, right? I mean, let's take the example of.
But then any single moral statement of any variety is an attack on the personhood of the person engaged in that activity. If I said drug users were doing something immoral, that would be an assault on the dignity of the drug user.
It certainly would be in the event that you described it in a kind of condescending way, right? I think that most drug users, if you were to talk to them, that would probably say that they have a problem and that they would want to get rid of it. Things are a little bit different.
And if I say it's squalid to use heroin, would that be condescending?
Absolutely, yes. And I don't necessarily think it'd be the most conducive way to actually encourage people to refrain from that kind of habit, because one of the things that these people need is encouragement and to feel like they have some kind of worth, not necessarily.
No, but like when I say heroin use is squalid, like I'm providing a service to people who aren't using heroin yet and might consider it. Because I mean, like, this is the problem, Matt. I mean, it's great we isolated this on drug use, because people might think that this is something that, like, that because it's so obvious to see it in this case, right? I mean, if this standard is like, okay, you can't say that drug use is gross if you can't communicate the drug, like, putting heroin into your body until it literally expires, until your arm literally turns black and falls off, which I've seen in these free clinics that give out clean needles. They put heroin into their arm until it turns black. And I can't call that gross because it's condescending.
It's
certainly what's the point of communication at that stage, right?
Well, because it's not actually conducive to the end that you want to obtain, which is actually people ceasing from engaging in these kinds of behaviors, because the feeling of being dehumanized and like they don't have any kind of worth is one of the reasons that they turn to these activities in the first place. But let's go back to your.
I'm not saying that the person. Let's go back that the activity is.
Let's go back to the earlier point, right? So you were asking, why is it that we can't have a more constructive dialogue with one another? And why is it that many progressives adopt this extremely militant attitude towards the right? Now, one of the things that I indicated is that I don't think that's necessarily true, certainly of all progressives, because many of us are certainly willing to dialogue with the right in the event that the right is willing to dialogue with us. But I also wanted to make it clear that this animosity goes both ways, right? You might feel attacked because of your belief system and feel a certain degree of resentment and victimhood on that basis. But it's also very much the case that the people that you denounce also feel like they are being attacked and victimized on that basis. And much like you say, people in your community are going to respond by getting agitated and sending angry emails and trying to say nasty things about people. People from communities that you target or that you conceive of as engaged in perverse activities are obviously going to also get angry and fire back at you.
I don't understand the point you're making. The problem with this is the fact that the institutions, like the asymmetry in the situation, is the fact that the university system is geared towards progressive ideas. It literally requires it. And the workplace is essentially geared towards the progressive side of these ideas too, and fires people for not obeying it.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that the workplace is actually conducive to progressive ideas.
Okay, I'll give you an example, right? I'll give you an example in my own, so I worked in academia for a long time in engineering, and to get academic positions, you have to fill out essays about how you support diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll put it this way. If in physics, I required every physicist that was hired to write to publicly profess that he believed that the universe was balanced on the back of a giant sea turtle, and I had a committee of sea turtleism that policed this inside the department, and I required that all new grants, and I filled out a bunch of them, they require essays on why you support diversity, equity, inclusion on the grants. Then every physicist would publicly proclaim that the universe was balanced on the back of a giant sea turtle, because that's how the incentives are structured. I don't take seriously any consensus that comes out of the university that intersects with diversity, equity, and inclusion. For the same reason, because it would be so, in the ridiculous example where it would be so easy to create a consensus of sea turtle believers if you required that of professors. The same thing is true for diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is totally institutionalized.
Sure, but I mean, you're focusing on the universities as the kind of primary locus of behaviors that you don't necessarily like. And I would actually agree with you that there are a lot of facets of university life that I think are very, 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 very bad. And for that matter, also very anti-progressive, right? But let's talk about the broader economy and the real problems that exist within it, right? So there are many circumstances where people work in conditions where they might not even be able to go to the bathroom, or they may not get paid a living wage, or where they may not actually be able to voice very legitimate concerns about their safety without being at risk of getting fired, let alone being able to form something like a union in order to try to agitate more effectively for their rights. And in this country, particularly over the last 50 years, but more or less throughout its history, all those kinds of activities have been highly constrained by the state, and also culturally for that matter. And I think that the more progressive approach to do resolving issues of workplace government would be to empower workers, whether at universities or indeed in various parts of the economy that are far less privileged than the kind of people that work in university settings. And let me finish. Yeah. I listened very, very politely while you were doing your talk. I think that that is the more pressing problem in these kinds of instances, because empowering workers through setting up mechanisms of accountability, including democratic mechanisms of accountability in the workplace, is a more long-term solution to the kind of disparities of power that you think are deeply problematic. And not only that, it's a far more general solution to a ubiquitous social problem than just saying we need to resolve this given problem at one particular institution, universities.
Well, universities would be a good example of how it's not being done.
Sure, I would absolutely agree with you. I mean, let's take any kind of university right now, right?
Well, I want to ask one more follow-up question on the original thing about disapprobation. Could if you saw like a neo-Nazi like waving a swastika flag, could you say like, I don't know, you don't have kids, do you?
No, I wish I could. I mean, don't have enough money for that, sadly.
Oh, okay. Well, pray. I thought
send the Soros check.
Oh, you think I'm getting paid for this?
No, I was talking about Soros.
The Soros check. Of course, that's your side.
You have to admit that was kind of
teal. The teal check is the right wing one. I keep on mixing teal and Soros up.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, but I mean, do you think you could say like neo-Nazism is gross?
Yes, absolutely, I would. Neo-Nazism is gross.
But wouldn't that dehumanize neo-Nazis?
Yes, it would. And
so then what's the difference in that and heroin use?
Well, there's a difference, right? I consider heroin use to be a medical condition that people largely aren't responsible for. And it's a problem that can be resolved through medical treatment, right? And the same is true.
It's the same thing. I mean, it's the same thing.
No, it's not. It's not the same thing at all, right? I mean, people are pushed towards drug use as a result of a wide array of social factors. Addiction is clinically proven to be something that is very difficult for people to overcome. And there's also a lot of evidence that suggests that the easiest way to help people overcome that is through treating it as a medical rather than a criminal issue. Neo-Nazism, by contrast, is very clearly a belief structure that people invest in and that they self-reflexively choose to adopt and practice in their own life. And I think it is very, very open to criticism on that basis.
Is communism?
Yes, I'd be critical of communism, right? I'm not a communist.
Marxism?
I think that there's a lot of good in Marxism. That's a different issue. But let's take communism.
I mean, I don't know. How you divide the line between those is totally subjective, in my opinion.
Oh, I don't think it's subjective at all. I
don't know. I mean, like, this is the problem, Matt, is that everyone on the left considers virtually all right-wingers to be iterations of Nazism. Well, if you say that like Nazism is bad, I mean, like, whatever. I mean, so you can say the same about George Washington.
Let's clarify then. Nazism is a very distinct form of right-wing thought, centered around a commitment to palingenetic ultranationalism and a commitment to the formation of a racial utopia. It is a very extreme form of right-wing thought, but it is no way in any shape or form indicatory of the broader and truly vast array of views on the right.
Like, Duginism is equivalent, and how different is that from nationalism?
Well,
I mean these divisions are kind of like ridiculous, in my opinion, right? I mean, like, for instance, I don't think there are people, for instance, who are like anti-Hitler Nazis, like they're National Socialists.
I do. I know.
Okay, so like, is that the equivalent of like Marxists in your book? Like they're not like really into this stuff. Like they're just into they're just into sort of like the primal ideology, like the specific like social programs of the Nazi Party with a little bit of nationalism mixed in.
No, I'd be critical of them all, right? But for different reasons, because they're different groups, right? So let's go back to the definition of Nazism that I gave, right? A kind of pelagianetic ultranationalism committed to the formation of racial utopia and the expungement of racial enemies, right? That is a very extreme form of right-wing thought that has been responsible for genocide on a truly industrial scale. And any well-thinking person.
Marxism is also responsible for genocide and industrial scale. Lots of ideologies.
Okay, but that's what I'm getting into, right? So Nazism absolutely must be emphatically condemned. And I think that anybody who is responsible on the right, particularly a right-wing Christian, would do just that, right? The issue with Marxism is considerably more complicated, right? Because there are a wide variety of influences that Marxism has had, ranging from its influence on social democratic parties to its influence on democratic socialist parties, and yes, to its influence on Stalinism, Maoism, and other forms of totalitarian ideology that we should absolutely condemn. And I would condemn, and I have condemned in the past. There's no forgiving what Stalin and Mao did, just like there's no forgiving what Hitler did.
Yeah, this is bullshit. I mean, you can see people like literally rehabilitate on. There are people who are rehabilitated on the left, like Alger Hiss, who literally cooperated with Stalin. Sure. And so this idea that Stalin is as toxic as Hitler or treated as toxic as Hitler on the left is ridiculous.
I don't think he is, but I don't think he is. But we're not talking about the broader left. We're talking about my own opinions because you invited me here, right?
This is, the reason why Stalin and the Marxism is excused is because it's on the left. It's not because it's like, it's somehow removed from the atrocities they committed. I mean, the history of the 20th century is the history of numerous left-wing genocides interrupted by one right-wing genocide, basically.
Well, not one right-wing genocide, right? Let's be clear. There are a wide variety of atrocities.
One ideological one, I suppose you could say. But
well, we don't need to like dive into the nuances of who did what here, right? But I do want to make clear though is that you are not talking to everybody on the left, right? I absolutely agree with you that there are people on the left who are apologists for Stalinism, Maoism, and a wide variety of other views that I think are repellent. And I don't think that any responsible leftist can actually say anything approving of them. It's one of the reasons why I identify with liberal socialism.
Would you call homophobia, what you call homophobia, gross and disgusting?
No, yes, I would.
And that wouldn't be dehumanizing to people who feel homophobia or homosexuality is a sin?
It is in a certain sense, right? But there's a very serious difference, right? Because in this case...
Do you see a pattern in this, Matt? Like, do you see where the exceptions lie to dehumanization in your process?
Yes, but the difference is I would never actually suggest that the state should be intervening in people's lives.
I didn't ask the state. I said the original example was, could I call heroin use gross?
Okay, so
your thing was no.
Yes, because there's a big difference, right? In one circumstance, you're talking about a medical condition where people are addicted to a very, very powerful substance that has had a destructive impact on their life, and where the best way for them to recover from that is not to be condescended to, but rather to seek medical care and to be treated as a human being, right?
Okay, so what you guys call homophobia is basically
in the other circumstance, right? What you're talking about is by definition fear of a given group, right? Homophobia, and this is a group
it's not. It's moral opposition. I'm not
okay. So you can you can describe it as moral opposition, but that's not the literal translation of homophobia, right? However, right?
That's not you know what I mean when progressives say homophobia. You don't believe that conservatives are afraid of homosexuals.
Well, some of them are, right? You'd be surprised. I've met them, right? But the point that I'm trying to get at is that is a self-conscious ideological position that people are taking that is intended to express hatred towards a given group. And while people should be allowed to hold those kinds of views, I think that they are ethically repellent and that we should be doing what we can in order to express condemnation of them.
But you've answered your own question, because that's a core contention. Virtually all of the right wing adheres to conservative religions that condemn homosexuality as a sin. Therefore, you have in this very speech commended, publicly renouncing them as being disgusting and reprehensible.
I don't think characterizing them as disgusting and reprehensible. I think characterizing homophobia as disgusting and reprehensible is something that's very important.
Okay, well, I'm just all I'm doing is condemn. Well, then I'll turn that around, right? I'll turn that around and say the exact same thing with pornography use and sexual impropriety and drug use. I'm not condemning the person. I'm just condemning. I mean, you know that that's the answer, Matt.
Yeah, I know that Matt Walsh does that all the time, right?
No, but okay. That's not something that Matt Walsh. And also, Professor, you know that Matt Walsh, like you criticize his theology. Matt Walsh doesn't have a theology. His theology is the theology of the body. It's John Paul II's theology, right? Like he didn't invent this theology. This is just the theology of all Christianity before like the 60s.
Oh, I know, but I mean,
this is
my criticism of him was on the basis that he doesn't really have a particularly good understanding of the theological basis of his own convictions, which I don't even think that you would disagree with, right? Since I don't think that you probably have.
I don't know the person. I don't know him personally.
Okay, well, I can guarantee you, if you read his books, that he doesn't really know particularly much. Let's put it this way about the more complicated nuances of Christian
that's thought. Fine. That's like every single like no Marxist has read Das Kapital. I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, yeah, the number of Marxists that have read Das Kapital must be in like below 1% easy.
You know, it's actually kind of funny. It is kind of funny. I actually know a number of Marxists, who would probably admit that, right? But the point that I'm trying to get at, right, is that homophobia to me is definitely a wrong, right? And it is something that should be condemned, because I think that we should be moving towards a society that not only tolerates but embraces queer individuals, right? Now, that does not mean that I think that state power should be executed on people in order to inhibit them from the expression of what I think are repellent views, because I have liberal inclinations on these kinds of issues, right? And the same thing applies when it comes to something like drug use, right? I absolutely think that drug use is a very bad thing. For the most part, right, with a couple of targeted exceptions. I think that we should be doing everything that we can in order to resolve the opioid epidemic. And the best way to go about doing so is to end the draconian war on drugs, which has been
we've been through your policy on drugs, but
exactly.
We've recreated the situation. You've got moral stances that condemn things I believe. I have moral stances that condemn things you believe. We both say them in public, right? So like saying that I disagree with you morally and believe your behavior is condemnable and you think my behavior is condemnable, that's the reality. Now, if that precludes conversation, then that's the end of liberalism right there, right? It must, if liberalism is to work, and I don't think it really is, but if it is to work, then that can't be a precursor to discussion, because we both have behaviors, we both have moral systems that condemn each other.
Absolutely.
And you can't just go like, well, he did it first. No, like it's both mutual.
Sure, but I mean, this is what I would argue is one of the benefits of living within a liberal society, right? It is certainly the case that there are certain broad rules that we both have to abide by in the event that we are able to cooperate and cohabitate with one another. But that doesn't necessarily require us to agree with one another on these kinds of moral issues. It doesn't even mean that we need to necessarily be polite with one another. All that we need to do is abide by these rules that have been subject to an overlapping consensus for a long period of time. And again, these circumstances, like I said, I do not think it is the state's job to intervene to try to eradicate through coercive measures these kinds of belief systems, even though I happen to think that they are repellent, right? I do think that it should be ethically condemned. The nub
comes into education, right?
Sure. And that's an area that we can have another discussion about some other time, because we're already well over time.
Okay.
Right?
Well, I don't know if you want to tap out. I got a heart from Pseudo-Analysis. Fritz Imperial for $3 says, Matt, the fact that you won't boldly and directly say that you believe Christ is Lord really makes me doubt that you're a Christian. Also, if you believe in dialogue, why did you mute me on Twitter? Well, Fritz, I think, Matt, you did say you believed in the Nicene Creed and the bodily resurrection of Christ, right?
I believe in the Nicene Creed. Bodily resurrection of Christ would be something that
the bodily creed is part of the Nicene Creed.
Yeah, but I don't necessarily know that I agree in the literal truth of the resurrection of Jesus. I do believe that Jesus is God, and that's the way that I symbolically understand my faith tradition, right? But I have complicated views on this subject matter. Like I said, my interpretation of my religious convictions is non-chauvinist, and it includes the conviction that there are a wide variety of ways that people can understand their route to accessing the divine, and that can include other religious belief systems as well.
Matt, this does feel kind of like you're telling me you believe in the Nicene Creed, but then you're just redefining it to not believe in the literal words of the Nicene Creed.
Well, there are certain parts of it that I agree with, right? I believe that Jesus is the Son of God.
Well, sure, but you could say that about Muslims, right? Muslims believe in certain parts of the Nicene Creed too, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right. But I mean, I don't necessarily need to buy into everything that the Bible says, and I mean, nobody does, right? I mean, my faith tradition is something that I've reconstructed out of my own theological convictions about what the best understanding of Christianity happens to be. It's informed, like I mentioned, by a number of different Christian theologians like Tillich and Niebuhr and a number of others that stress the importance of less the formal aspects of Christianity and more the moral imperative of Christianity to engage in good works. And this includes a political dimension where it is absolutely essential that we should be doing more in order to look after the least well off, where I feel that our society has been very deficient in many kinds of respects, right? So
yeah, I believe in looking after the least well off. That's what motivates my positions on the whole drug thing that we disagreed with. But
sure, but I mean, we have different means and different conceptions about what that would entail pretty clearly, right? And your circumstance, and you've made this very clear, you think that one of the ways to deal with something like drug dealers, for example, would be to institutionalize them, right? And I imagine taking more draconian
drug
stance.
Dealers, I'd probably just throw in jail, but drug users, I would definitely
right?
institutionalize them.
Yeah,
in a
drug
mental
users and
hospital.
drug dealers, right? They should be institutionalized, right? I don't actually think that that's the right way to go about doing this.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I think the bigger problem is just the sort of, I mean, the problem is that Christianity has a certain kind of meaning to it it's very consistent, and I with all of these progressive forms of Christianity, it feels like progressivism with a Christian skin suit, right? I mean, it does seem, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Matt, like this sort of the Christianity that you talk about in your articles on Zizek, it sounds like you believe that an individual creates their own meaning themselves.
Well, that's an interpretation of Zizek's materialist Christianity and not necessarily my own theological convictions, right? So Zizek's interpretation of Christianity is highly idiosyncratic, but it's derived largely from the writings of Jorge Hegel, right? So Hegel famously interpreted the book of Genesis to be a story, if you want to put it really simply, about man's emancipation from nature rather than a fall.
Sure. I know it's basically not. I mean, it's not even original. It's Gnostic. That's Gnostic's interpretation too.
Well, not necessarily, right? Because Gnosticism has a somewhat different interpretation of the history leading up to Christian thought and the history after Christian thought.
Sure. We can't get into the distinction.
Yeah, we don't need to, right? But Zizek's materialist Christianity isn't coextensive with my own, right? What I think is interesting about it is, again, this notion of Christianity as a as a religion that symbolically indicates the transition of human beings from natural beings to self-conscious beings. And I think that it did really a brilliant job of articulating this symbolic transition, or this transition, in fact, however you just want to conceive it, in the Genesis myth and in the broader swath of biblical stories. So I think
this actually is a big disagreement between two of us. With me, I need language needs to be incredibly clear and concise and simple. Mm-hmm. The ability of language to expand past its ability to be analyzed is a core belief of mine. When you do analytical, and we had disagreement on Twitter about this, I don't know if I emphasize this enough, when you do formalized theoretical construction and jargon, the complexity of the idea goes up exponentially, and your analytical ability is linear. So as you add on jargon and caveats and embellishments on sort of simple ideas, your understanding of it will actually decrease, not increase, as you do the analysis. And this is what I deeply believe about philosophy of things like Hegel and Plato, is I think that the theorizing about them is almost useless, because I think the utility is in the meditation. I think the utility is in the spirit.
The utility is in the spirit of philosophy.
Yeah, and I think Hegel is a great example of this. I've read several of Hegel's books, and they're like Greek. Like I could read them 5 times and not. And I had literally 2 PhDs in it. I went 3 PhDs in Hegel, and they all renounce each other's points of view.
They do, yeah.
Like, okay, well, that's 200 years old, right? 200 years of this, and we couldn't come up with any consistent reading of one of the biggest philosophers of all time. Like, that would never happen in science. So, I mean, but I will say this about Hegel: his idea of dialectics in history, like, it kind of works in a weird way.
It does.
Right?
Yeah.
It kind of works in a weird way. So, I mean, and the same thing with Platonic forms too. Although there are people like Kurt Gödel who did actually formalize Platonism, interestingly enough.
He did, and he was actually a very big fan of the ontological proof of God's existence. Little known fact about him, right?
Versions of it, but that's not the reason why people like Plato was not in anticipation of when Kurt Gödel. I'm sure he wasn't the first person to formalize it.
No,
it was not in anticipation of when we could write it down in formal language. It was because Plato, and perhaps vicariously Socrates, has a certain spirit of wisdom that carries through the text that's greater than the analysis itself. Now, when it comes to religion, Christianity has a very consistent spirit and a very consistent set of answers. And I feel when we twist the words to mean what they don't want to mean, what we're doing is we're allowing ourselves to inject our own preferences into Christianity. Like, there's things that I don't like about Christianity, and I can't change them.
Sure,
right?
but I mean, this is where you and I differ about what the best interpretation of Christianity should be, right? Because from my perspective, Christianity could never be conducive to any kind of reactionary viewpoint, right? Now, we don't need to get into the nuts and bolts about this, but let's go back to the kind of...
that's a little bit why.
Okay, well, this is what I'm getting at, right? So let's talk about somebody like Joseph de Maistre, who I think can demarcate the distinction between us, I think, a little bit more clearly, right? Joseph de Maistre would probably be very empathetic towards your position. In a famous work...
I'm basically copying it from him there.
Yeah, I figured, right? So in a very famous series of passages, he talks about how it is that submitting important political and moral questions to the deliberation and rationalization of everybody will undo respect for authority, because everybody will have a different opinion about what the truth is and what is moral. And consequently, there'll be no consensus. And so the best thing for people would be, rather than adopting an inquiring position when it comes to big ontological, theological, and moral questions, instead to insist that they treat them like dogmas. Because if
look, you can go more right wing than Christian. Like, you can go to, like, the perfect example of this would be the infamous story, the Grand Inquisitor from Brothers Karamazov.
Beautiful
you
story.
can get more right wing than Jesus. And it's not my job to get more right wing than Jesus. This is like my original saying. Like, I don't have a principle towards hierarchy.
Okay, but let me finish, right? This is, again, where you see different conceptions of what religion is supposed to be about, and for that matter, different conceptions of what philosophy is supposed to be about, right? This emphasis on not submitting moral, political, and ontological questions to general speculation in order to maintain dogmatic respect for authority is something that a lot of reactionaries have broad sympathy for. And there are reasons to have broad sympathy for them, because that's conducive to order, because most people aren't able to inquire into philosophical questions very effectively, and also because, quite frankly, too much disruption can lead to the disintegration of society and the reemergence of the state of nature and the war of all against all.
Okay,
right?
Sure. Yeah.
So the distinction is that progressives have always emphasized the importance of virtue as flowing from this continuous interrogation of the truth by an engaged and active citizenry, because we see this as conducive to A, the good life individually, and B, the civic life generally. And this is one of the reasons why progressives, including progressive Christians, tend to be attracted to democracy, because under ideal circumstances, this is a situation where people individually and collectively are required to do just what de Maistre says that they shouldn't do, constantly inquire into these kinds of questions.
You can deconstruct anything,
Yeah, exactly. And most progressives would see this as inherently a kind of virtuous activity. And there are reasons for this that go back to what
unless you do to progressive principles, then they'll freak out.
Well, no, I think that if anything, what you've seen recently has been a very robust debate on the left about a wide variety of issues. And certainly within liberalism, there's been just an endless series of debates about what is entailed by liberalism, right?
I'm thinking more like equality stuff, especially around like race and stuff like that.
Sure. Well, let's not get into that, because we've already covered
we
so
won't.
Much
but I mean, I don't see, like, my job is to follow Christ, not just to be right wing. Like, yeah, I adopt right wing positions because they're implied by the faith, and some left wing ones. Like, I'm not the Grand Inquisitor from Dostoevsky here. Like, I'm
glad to hear that. Yeah.
But I mean, the reason why I'm reactionary is because society has gone way to the left past Christian orthodoxy. And so most of the mistakes, I mean, I spent like half the summer arguing with right Nietzscheans, so I'm not unfamiliar with debates against right wingers. But like, that's not.
I wrote a collection on Nietzsche that came out recently, so I empathize. That's a hard struggle. But listen, the point that I was getting at with de Maistre, right, is that I think that deep down, there's a part of you that is concerned with the disintegrationist or deconstructive effect that too much inquiry will have over the broad swath of society. Would we agree on that?
Yeah,
right?
That's definitely a problem.
So if you wanted to demarcate what separates the left from the right on both religious and political questions of this matter, it would be that most reactionaries and most conservatives would probably be attracted to some iteration of the Demastrian or Burkean argument for that matter, whereas progressives tend to see something virtuous in itself about adopting the Socratic disposition of continuously inquiring into the nature of truth, continuously putting it under pressure, and trying to generalize that into a broader political principle. Right? There's a reason that Socrates says he wants to live in the city because it's only in the city that he can engage in his dialectic. Right? Now, how to go about doing that has obviously been subject to an ongoing debate on progressives, including amongst progressive progressions. But the feeling is that by encouraging people to do that, you get something like what Kant described, where by requiring people to interrogate their own belief systems and to subject them to rational scrutiny, they will A, develop the virtue of intellectual curiosity, and B, ultimately come to stand by their convictions in a more forceful kind of way than they would under dogmatic circumstances, because now they've had to arrive at a self-conscious disposition where they agree with what they believe in rather than having it imposed upon them as some kind of dogma.
But how does that make it, I mean, you're saying that Christianity has some progressive element into it. And I agree with that. It's not the most right-wing thing in the world, right? But
no, not at all. And I think that, again, this is one of the things that you see consistently in various forms of left-wing Christianity, right? So take, for example, somebody like Soren Kierkegaard, right?
You can get to the, I think we're overcomplicating this, right? There are some elements in Christianity that have right-wing conclusions, and there are some elements in Christianity that have left-wing conclusions. And I mean, the point is not just to be as right-wing as possible. The point is to, like I said before, there's two imperatives: the survival of the human race and the communion of the human race with God. Those are the two primary political imperatives. And sub to that, I want to preserve my people and my faith tradition into the future. If what you are proposing helps that objective, then that's fine. I don't care if it's left wing or not. But
okay, well, I'm glad. And so maybe we can reach some kind of consensus on that, which might actually be a nice place to end on, right? Because I think that what you would see both left wing and right wing Christians agree upon is this notion that it is deeply important for social policies to address the spiritual and cultural rot that is latent within our society, and that seems to have ubiquitous and damaging effect on people across the board. Okay, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I need to get a few super chats to you because I know you have to go. The one creeper weirdo asks, what does a good leftist or left-wing family look like? And do we need to remove right-wing families for them to exist?
No, I don't think that we need to remove right-wing families, right? I mean, I should point out, right, a lot of my friends growing up were very conservative and still are very conservative, and many of them have very happy family lives. And we meet and we argue about politics, as I'm sure you do with your progressive family, and we all get along reasonably well, right? But I would never deny that conservatives can be upstanding family men, and even for that matter, upstanding members of their community. Okay.
Well, I mean, right now there's a huge deficit of progressive families in our generation.
That could very well be, but I would argue that a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's very difficult to form meaningful family units in these kind of circumstances because people are at an economic disadvantage for a lot of reasons when it comes to doing so. And I would argue that this thing, I'll just give you this little piece of information. The difference gets bigger the richer people get or the more educated they get. So, you know, if you're underclass, if you're working class, the conservative guy will have a slightly larger family. Once you get to like PhD levels, like the conservative guy has a medium family and the progressive guy has like no family or no kids. Well, so it gets more radical as you go up the educational level. So I don't really see the economics to be a good explainer of that. Well, I actually think it's a very good explainer of it, right? And part of the reason is because people who tend to pursue more advanced careers, like higher education, typically need to dedicate a lot more time to it, right? It takes a long time to get a PhD, as you know, and as I know. And so by the time you hit the point where you're getting your first job, you'll probably already be where I am, 35, 30,
Yeah.
the child you are. And at that point, it's a much bigger question to ask. Do I want to have kids? Especially since, say, my circumstance, I'm not a rich guy and I don't think I ever will be, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a big ask, right? So I think that were you to change the structure of things like intellectual labor and the intellectual job market, then you might see people be more attracted to this idea of having children because they might not necessarily need to wait so late in life to make the decision about whether or not they want to have kids. And then it might not be such a pressing objection. But again, I can't necessarily hypothesize about that because we don't live in that kind of society. We live in one where it takes a very long time in order to pursue highfalutin kind of careers. So we'd have to change things and see.
So someone asks, the wretched of the earth has a very racialized undertone to it. Why does the left accept cathartic African-American violence, but condemn other forms of nationalist violence? I don't know. I mean, this is similar to my question about, well, I mean, I think this is about discretional policing and the fact that there's been a huge explosion of violent crime in America post the George Floyd riots. And, I mean, it seems like it's not being confronted, and it's largely not being confronted for political reasons. It would appear to me.
It would appear to you that the stuff related to the George Floyd riots isn't being, isn't being policed sufficiently?
Yeah. So after the George Floyd riots, there's a huge decrease in discretional policing in most urban areas with large African-American populations. And this resulted in an elevated crime rate that's killed a ton of people, mostly African Americans. And
all right, I understand the question.
There's like not much outcry about that, right?
Okay,
and
so
there's less outcry about the 1,000 people more that died of gun violence in Chicago and New York than there is about one guy getting accidentally killed on the subway.
Okay, well, I think that the answer to this from a progressive standpoint is that you won't actually end animosity without actually trying to address the foundational reasons why it is that people still endure very, very differential outcomes based upon race in this country. And there's a lot of empirical evidence to back this up, right? That Black communities tend to be over-policed in this country.
Over-policed relative to what?
Relative to white communities, certainly affluent communities that are guilty.
Not relative to the crime they commit?
Well, this is kind of the idea of over-policing, right? So, for instance, let's use your favorite example. Whites are policed to a far less extent when it comes to drug-related crimes than minority communities, right? So there's a disproportionate number of people who go to jail in minority communities for drug deals or drug use than what you'd find in white, let alone affluent communities, even when the people are doing exactly the same thing, right? And there's
what we're talking about is murders right now. That's what you immediately, if you look at the crime statistics, what immediately jumps out to you is the differential rates of murders. So, I mean, like, if there's a community that's committing more murders, you police that community more than the community that's committing less murders, right?
Well, this is the way that progressives tend to approach this, right? There doesn't seem to be an awful lot of evidence that expanding the parameters of the carceral state does an awful lot in order to minimize crime. There is
but discretional police, like, forget about like how long they're sentenced. First of all, I think. I mean, if they're sentenced for murder, they're going to be sentenced for a long time, regardless, right? But like, if Chicago is very black, Salt Lake City is very white. That's a bad example, but like you could say, like the south side of Chicago is very black, the north side not so much, right? The police are going to be in the south side of Chicago more to stop the enormous amount of murders there. Right, that's not under policing. That's policing proportionate to the amount of crime that occurs.
So you're talking about violent crime. Okay, so in these kind of instances, obviously there is an argument to be made that we should actually have the police respond to violent crime in marginalized communities, right? And in some circumstances, there are actually instances where the police don't tend to respond in a very receptive way to violent crimes when they're committed by minorities against one another, right? However, the long-term solution to violence in many of these communities, I think, is ultimately twofold, right? One is ending the system of racialization and racial disadvantage that has been persistent in this country since 1619, really, or at least 1620. And the second is to try and create economic opportunities in these communities where people can form meaningful attachments with one another, feel that they have some hope for the future, and ultimately decide that they want to commit themselves to constructing.
Why hasn't this worked?
Well, there are a lot of
I go to Berkeley again, right? But or San Francisco, their current proposal is reparations for they're not going to pay this because there's not enough money in the world to pay this. But the current shitlib proposal, the people who are, supposedly to your right, like Nancy Pelosi, and their expert panel is recommending a payout of $1.2 million for every African American, and these communities are having money dumped into them to fix this problem. It doesn't seem to be fixing the problem.
Well, in also part because they have these social policies haven't been particularly well implemented, right? And they haven't been particularly well thought through. So I want to make it very clear, right? Not every welfarist measure that has been implemented since the 1970s is necessarily something that I would support. It really has to be based upon evidence-based research on their effectiveness, right? In a variety of different contexts. Right?
I think there's a lot of evidence-based research that indicates that high discretional policing stops people from murdering each other.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, right? In circumstances where you find communities that have also been subject to high degrees of racialization, but you don't see this kind of carceral approach to crime.
What do you mean by racialization?
Well, the United States has been a very racist country for a very long period of time. I don't think anybody would deny that, right? And racialization refers to the process where somebody is coded as member of an inferior community, and where the various social institutions and legal institutions reflect this sense of their inferiority, right? And engender kind of systematic disadvantages as a result of that. And systematic advantages, of course, to the dominant group. So let's take two case studies, right? In Canada, Canada has comparatively high levels of policing next to the United States, but far, far lower than what you see here. And we also have a far lower incarceration rate. Despite that, in many parts of the country, crime in Canada, including within all kinds of communities, is considerably lower than it is.
That's because you have less African Americans, or you have less Africans.
Oh, is that what you think?
That's just a fact.
Yeah.
That's what this tracks everywhere, right?
So you think that
you think that you could take the population, you could take the government of Ontario and just have it police Chicago and get less crime?
No, I think that the solution isn't ultimately to sit there and try to use the power of the cultural state in order to resolve these situations, because I ultimately don't think that that's been shown to be effective, right? The U.S. has tried to adopt tough on crime policies for a period of about 40 years now that have had a remarkably destructive effect on
you can literally see the tough on crime policies going in and out of New York with Giuliani, and then out in 2020.
Yeah, exactly. And this has a direct correlation.
Crime went down, and then
even a causal relation to exactly the kind of problem that you're talking about, right? So let's take recidivism rates, right? There's a lot of evidence that suggests that if you are charged with a crime and you go to jail, and you're allowed to leave before the age of 25, you have a pretty good shot of actually not winding up back in jail, because you might decide that you want to do something else with your life. In the event that you are given a long sentence as part and parcel of trying to deter crime, what ends up happening is we've actually seen recidivism rates increase quite significantly. The reason being quite commonsensical, right? If you send somebody to jail at 18 until they're 28, and then they get back to their community, they don't really have an awful lot of options for them. They've entered into the criminal justice system. They've been criminalized, and the only options available for them are eventually to go back to doing what they were before, and then they wind up back in jail.
I'm very aware of this story, but I don't see how. So the idea is by not arresting violent criminals, you're going to stop violent crime. That does not appear to be working.
Yeah, it's not working, because that's what the United States has been trying to do for a long period of time, right?
I'm saying that not enforcing the law thing is not working. The only showing up after the crime is committed does not work.
Well, again, let's compare two case studies, right? In the United States, where people have tried to adopt this kind of tough on crime approach, which includes sentencing people for long periods of time to prison, what we've seen are extremely high recidivism rates and the perpetuation of crime in a wide variety of different communities, usually those that are poor, and that doesn't necessarily track exclusively in the way that you think it does, right? And so
what do you mean?
So my argument would be that in these kind of circumstances, what we need to do is adopt a far less draconian approach to the policing of crime, because it doesn't seem to actually be all that effective.
We essentially removed discretional policing in 2020, and things got worse.
Sorry, move discretional policing in
Yeah, we lessen discretional policing, right? People were policed less in African American communities from late 2020 to 2023, where we are now, and violent crime massively increased.
Well, there are a lot of different reasons for that, right? I mean, you're talking about the middle of a pandemic where there was widespread political animosity in the country.
By the way, this did not happen in countries like Asia.
This did not happen in countries like Asia, yeah, because in many circumstances, people were thrown in jail en masse well before they had
Asian
the opportunity.
countries. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, well, let's make a comparison, right? So take a country like Singapore, right? Singapore is an example that is frequently pointed to on the right as an example of a state that they would like to emulate, right? One of the things that's less discussed by the right about Singapore is the fact that at points in its history, about 80% of people lived in public housing, right? Very, very important in a small island. Not only that, Singapore has huge levels of migration, right? In order to perform the most menial tasks that most Singaporeans don't want to do. These are people who typically live outside of the city in extraordinarily difficult conditions. And
we call this the IQ shredder on the right wing.
Well, and so in these kind of circumstances, let me ask you, right? If you wanted a kind of society that looks something like Singapore, would you be willing to endorse a position where the state provided?
I don't want a society that looks like Singapore, because Singapore has rock bottom birth rates and family formation.
Okay, but if you wanted a society with low crime rates like Singapore, right? Would you be willing to implement something like 80% social housing for all individuals in the United States? Because there's no doubt that that contributes to these low crime rates, because it means that people, if nothing else, at least have a place to live and some investment in retaining the system that seems to benefit them in a certain kind of way. Be hugely expensive.
I'm not against building social housing, like just in the abstract, you mean?
Like, yes. But I mean, not just building social housing, right? 80% social housing.
Well, are you talking about seizing people's houses from them?
No, I'm talking about providing homes to anyone who needs them.
Okay, so like building them. Okay, fine. If you're gonna build new, I'm a big fan of building new houses. That's one of the policy proposals that I like the most. Yes.
Okay,
I want to build new houses.
So
I'd like to sell them to people because I want people to be homeowners. But I guess in a pinch, it's fine if you want the state to manage it in the interim. Although I'd really like people to own homes.
Yes, I would tend to agree with that, right? And this is one of the reasons that I think public housing needs to be associated with an ongoing process that allows people to eventually own their homes, right? But what I'm talking about in these kind of instances is you're pointing to East Asia as an example of a comparatively low crime society without necessarily talking about the very, very, very expansive ways in which government has intervened in order to provide people with the basic necessities that they need. And I would argue that if there is a lesson that we should take from Singapore, it's the fact that providing people with a home was something that actually disinclines them from engaging in criminal activity. We don't have something like that in the United States at nearly the same level. We don't even have that in a country like Canada. So why not do something like that here, if it seems to work in the way that you described?
I mean, it's like housing projects, I mean?
Yeah, but certainly nowhere nearly on the scale of what you see in Singapore. And
I mean, if you want to, I don't have really a moral objection to this. If you want to make if Chicago wants to make housing projects, or San Francisco wants to make housing projects, then it should make housing projects. It would be a way better use of its money than dumping it into this reparations thing they've been talking about for the last.
Okay, good. So then
so like that's fine.
Okay, so then
I really don't think that's going to stop. That's going to confront this expansion of murders you've seen in the last 2 or 3 years since the George Floyd riots started.
Well, why not? It's a long-term solution to a problem, right? I mean, at the current moment, right, we are spending tens of billions of dollars a year funding the prison system. And we have the largest incarceration rates in the world and extremely high levels of recidivism, largely as a result of people, again, going back to crime because they don't feel that there are any other kind of opportunities available to them.
The African American community is a good case study in this, actually, Matt.
So
right?
in the event that you want to actually see declining crime rates, why not take an example from the country that you claim that you think is a model to emulate, at least in some respect, and say, let's stop building prisons and build social housing instead. Allow everybody who needs it to have access to a home. And that way we can invest.
Matt, I didn't object to that. You're just repeating the proposal again. I said, fine, go ahead if you want to.
So then
if you're wondering why that's not sufficient, is that there was this thing called the projects in the 70s, right? If you look at the history of the African American community, like you think that I think that the African American community is unique. I do not. What happened to the African American community is happening to the white community as well, just with a time lapse. And what you see in the African American community is that what destroyed it was drugs, lack of religiosity, and the sexual revolution. That was the triple whammy that did it. And then also the race riots in the 60s. Right?
Oh, really?
And you go from a community, and also the jobs moving, that hurt also a lot. But that was more in the 70s.
Well, I would also say that about 3-4 centuries of racial discrimination probably contributed its fair share.
No, but Matt, I'm comparing 1951 to 1981. That's the same country. There was actually more racism in 1951, right?
Well, I mean, this is one of the issues where we have to talk about ongoing ways in order to help people who are economically disadvantaged obtain economic advantage, right?
But what I'm saying is, over this period of 20 years, racism went down, public housing went up, and at the same time, the crime rate exploded and the families fell apart. And that's because public housing might be good, and racism, I don't like bigotry. It's distasteful. It's bigotry is a distasteful vice. But what we've seen is that public housing and decreasing racism is not the driver in crime. What drives crime is family dissolution, drugs, lack of jobs, and lack of policing.
I would actually argue that there's a very different set of reasons behind it. So take during the 1980s, right? During the Reagan Revolution, right? There's evidence to suggest, and this is from Gary Dorian's book, A History of Democratic Socialism in the United States, that because of the implementation of Reaganomic policies, what you saw is declining real incomes in huge swaths of racialized communities. Associated with this was declining public help, declining public services, and also less access to the kind of educational promises that were offered to them or promised to them by things like Brown v. Board of Topeka. And aligned with this was increasing policing and an expansion of the Carceral state, which led to exactly the same problems I was talking about before: higher recidivism rates, criminalization of large numbers of community, over-policing of minority communities for the same crimes that are being committed by white communities, but white communities can get away with it. All of this
I'm talking about murders. Let's stick on murders here, right?
Well, we really do have to go, though. So why don't we take one more question, because it's 11:38 now.
Okay, yeah, you're right. We're an hour over. Here, there's a bunch for you, but I'm going to try to combine this into one. Just give me a chance to compose this here.
Sure.
Okay, I'll ask I'll try to paraphrase Creeper Roberto's question off when you're here, because sorry guys, I can't fit all your questions because the answers are just too long. That's not it. These are complicated questions, so I'm not trying to dig on you, Matt. But
sure. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground.
This is. I mean, there's two. The last 4 questions have kind of a common theme. The first one is, I used to be progressive, and there's 2 things. This person, Arden Cobb and Pac-Man Respecter, both bring up the same thing that turn me off from being progressive. There's 2 things that really turn me off. First of all, like everything you're telling me right now, I've been told to people who literally work in the government of places like San Francisco and Berkeley and who are CEOs of Silicon Valley companies. These ideas are super popular among our ruling class. Why haven't, and they've been popular for 40 years at least, for all the time I've been alive. And so there's a question of why haven't they been done? Is every other progressive just an idiot? And the second one is, it seems to me that there's this strange idea that the human beings aren't capable of self-destruction when provided with attractive choices. I don't blame the African American. I feel sorry for the African American community. What happened to them in the last 50 years has been atrocious. When you see, they had their own community.
Well, what happened in the 400 years was pretty atrocious. Let's be clear about that.
Well, yeah, sure. But I'm talking about the last 40 or 50 that I've been alive. I mean, the amount of community cohesion they had in the early 60s is impossible to imagine. The amount of Black families there were, it's just, it brings a tear to your eye when you see it. And I mean, it's all essentially been implemented under the guise of progressive policies. And the reason is people don't necessarily make the right decisions when they're given the choice, right?
Okay, well, let's take the question in two, right? You say that these policies are deeply attractive to the ruling class. I think that I can't even imagine how you would consider such a thing, right? So let's
because they literally told me the exact same thing you're telling me right now.
Sure. So I'm sure that there are a number of progressive individuals who told you that these are the kind of policies that you want to see that they want to see implemented. But let's talk about whether they have actually been implemented effectively over the last 40 years or so, right? So what we've seen since the 1970s, the heyday of social democracy, has been a consistent rolling back of the welfare state, of unionization rates, a declining fall in real wages brought about by a wide variety of factors.
When you say rolling back of the welfare state, do you just mean the Clinton era welfare reform? Entitlements haven't generally gone down, right?
Oh, they certainly have, right? I mean, think again about
why we spend more in entitlements now in inflation adjusted dollars than we did per capita than we did in the 70s.
Oh, absolutely. Because Medicare and Medicaid expenses have gone up. Everybody is aware of that, right? But in terms of actually funding new kinds of initiatives or funding any other kinds of initiatives beyond Medicare and Medicaid, which is also seriously underfunded, you haven't really seen much imagination or expansion, and you have seen retraction in many other respects, particularly with something like the movement away from welfare to something like food stamps or workfare, for example. Right, which had a very destructive effect on any number of communities. But let's be clear, right? This isn't an issue of party ideology either, right? This is something that has been implemented by both Democrats and Republicans, all of whom, regardless of their convictions on cultural issues, are committed to exactly the same kinds of economic programs. Neoliberalization, meritocratic mythology, and the defunding of social institutions that were supposed to bind communities together, because the underpinning ethos of this is that people need to look after themselves, as Margaret Thatcher once very eloquently put it, right?
So and Matt, people can't look after themselves. Do we agree on that?
I would agree, right? And we should.
And the reason why is they make bad decisions.
Well, this is again where I think we differ when it comes to things like moral issues, right? But I just want to be very clear about the ruling class position, right? The ruling class has had no serious desire to implement anything remotely like the kind of progressive economic agenda that even would have been on the table in the 1950s in this country. If anything, it is really telling that the most radical personality in this country is Bernie Sanders. And all that Bernie Sanders wants to do is introduce the kind of reformisms that would make the United States into a mediocre Western social democratic state, not even a premier Western social democratic state.
Is Canada a premier Western social democratic state?
No, not at all. In fact,
is anywhere outside of Norway or the Scandinavian countries a premier?
Well, maybe Denmark, Norway, Sweden.
Then those are all Nordic countries. Is there any non-Nordic country that's a premier democratic socialism or social democracy?
Well, I quite like Germany for exactly the reasons that I mentioned, right? Particularly this co-determination model that I think is something that we could emulate on a broad scale. But let's, again, talk brass tacks, right? The fact that Bernie Sanders is the most radical figure to have emerged in U.S. politics since the 1930s, and what he is proposing is nothing more than the kind of things that would have been vanilla social democracy in mid-century, really tells you just how far we've come in terms of what is regarded as the economic consensus.
Okay, so in California, like, we are definitely taxing and spending a lot more, and that's not going to Medicare. That's going to just a variety of different boondoggle programs across the state. Now, I mean, I guess the taxes are incredibly high there on the middle class. Like, a lot of people move to get away from the taxes. Yeah, and that paired with inflation is nuts. And so, what is this? What do ultimately they have to show for this stuff? It seems like virtually nothing. They completely destroyed the California Republican Party. It's basically a monoparty state. Congratulations, you guys did it. You destroyed the conservatives. And since they did, I mean, I don't think it's because they destroyed the Republicans. I hate Republicans, but the state's just been getting worse under their rule.
Sure, but I mean, I don't necessarily think that the Democrats can be trusted with implementing a genuinely progressive economic agenda for all the reasons that I mentioned, right?
Do you need more money?
Do they need more money? No, what we
Yeah.
need is structural economic reform that empowers working class groups to be able to have more of a say in their workplace and in the economy overall.
So you could take the money that California currently has and fix all of the problems we discussed in California, do you think?
No, not at all, because that wouldn't necessarily create the kind of structural reforms that I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are an overlapping series of progressive and socialist reformations or reforms in the country. Probably the most crucial of which would be trying to increase union density to levels that are comparable to what it was in the 1950s, when workers did actually see dramatic increases in their real wages and did actually receive extraordinary benefits relative to what most people get today. And I think that the reason that that needs to happen is because without strong unions, it'll be very difficult to form a meaningful political coalition with a kind of clout that could push for more state redistribution in an effective way. But I also think it is possible to actually push for more modest kinds of reform. I have no idea what the kind of public policy looks like in California that you're talking about, but there are a wide variety of different initiatives.
I can list programs, but I mean,
the
famous ones like the high-speed rail that cost.
Okay, sure, but I'm not in California, right? I have no idea what's going on there, nor do I have any interest in learning about it, right? But let's take an example of a kind of progressive reform that's
I
been
could use
floated.
Detroit if you'd rather, right?
Well, I'm not from Detroit, so let's talk a little bit about progressive reform that's been put forward from a wide variety of different groups, right? The universal basic income, right? I don't think that a UBI, for example, is the solution to all our problems. I'm not, part of the Yang Gang. But there is evidence from case studies conducted in Ontario, in South Africa, and a wide variety of other places. I think it was Denmark, that show that a UBI.
South Africa, do you say?
Yeah, they actually implemented it. You can read the book "Give a Man a Fish" by an anthropologist, which talks about local efforts to implement UBI in historically marginalized communities.
What did happen in South Africa?
We're not getting into all that.
Okay, but I mean,
So no, let me finish about my main point, right? So a universal basic income, for example, is something that has a relatively broad consensus behind it. It does actually have empirical data backing it up that demonstrates that it can be conducive to the well-being of the people who receive it. We're not sure whether or not it would have a inefficiency cost when it comes to the broader economy, because we've never implemented it. But it's certainly something that I'd be willing to experiment with as a kind of placeholder measure for the kind of more dramatic structural reorganizations that I think are necessary.
Would this be in place of existing programs or in addition?
It could very well depend on context, right? I mean, here I tend to be an empiricist and think that what we need to do is evaluate the efficacy of these programs and the way that they interact with other kinds of initiatives, right? It could very well be that if we implement something like the UBI and it becomes no longer necessary in order to establish other kinds of social programs, then we could redirect those monies towards other kind of progressive reforms. Personally, I think that what we should try to do is introduce something like that while also making sure that more basic services that everyone is eventually going to use are well funded, particularly something like Medicare and Medicaid that should be publicly available. But again, I'm open-minded about these kind of things because what we need to do is experiment and see what ends up working. But the most important part of my policy program or prescriptions would be, again, increasing union density, since I think that's the only way in the long term that you're going to see progressive economic reform, since that will form a bloc that is capable of agitating for it in the long run.
I don't know what union density is supposed to do when there's a surplus of labor that keeps on coming in from immigration. What's it like? The leverage is all gone. I mean, the leverage, you're going to try to increase union density, and then in the 1950s, it worked because there was a closed immigration policy and labor was in high demand. But now the demand for labor is bottoming out. And you put people in unions if you want to. Most people will be out of a job.
I don't think that's necessarily true at all, right? I mean, if you look over the last 2 years or something, for the very first time, we've actually seen union density in private sectors actually increase. And a large part of that was due to agitation on the part of Amazon workers, Starbucks workers, Trader Joe workers very recently, right? So there's no necessity that requires us to actually sit there and accept low union density as some kind of inevitable fact of nature. It can be changed through political agitation.
I don't like, again, I don't have a moral problem with unions. If you want to unionize, go ahead and unionize.
Good.
The thing is I just don't believe that. I believe that supply and demand is the driver. If you want to make labor more valuable, you're going to have to create some barrier between capital, its location, and labor, which means it's going to have to be in restricting trade and restricting immigration. Because if immigration can move to where the capital holders are, then you're going to have a flood of labor, and the labor is going to be dirt cheap. And we can repackage it. We can slap union labels on it as much as we want. The supply and demand is not some imposition by capitalism. Supply and demand is just reality, and you might not like it, but I don't like it. But that's just how it is. And I don't know. I mean, again, this isn't what I see when I look at California is essentially a state that has been degrading for 30 years and has been degrading under just failed progressive policies.
Well, certainly the quality of its cultural productions has declined. I'll give you that.
The quality of its cultural productions has, oh God, has it ever?
So sorry, we really do need to go.
Yeah.
So why don't you ask one more question,
Yeah,
and then we'll go.
Sure. Oh, you a last question?
Yeah, I'm going to take one more, and we'll close out
Okay.
at midnight.
Progressive. Okay. Yeah, I guess the questions I'm all getting is sort of it does feel a little bit like, well, I mean, it feels a lot like this. It feels like progressive policies have never implemented right. Real communism's never been tried. Real socialism's never been tried.
One day.
The thing is with all of these things, what the examples that we kind of, it always feels like the examples that work really well in societies that are already kind of exogenously rich, or they have some kind of very, very highly cohesive culture, like the Nordic models. And these social policies don't so much generate the outcomes as sit on top of them and look good. So, there's a sort of retroactive effect of let me see if I can actually form this into a question. So I'm trying to put people's questions.
No, I take what you're saying, right? So let's just respond to that, and then we'll close out. Okay. So let's take the Nordic example as a good one, right? It's actually something of a mischaracterization to describe Sweden, for example, or Norway for that matter, as relatively homogenous countries prior to the advent of social democracy. Actually, what was really quite striking about Sweden in particular was it was one of the most aristocratic societies in the entire world. Maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing to you. And there was intense caste conflict that actually almost boiled down.
Actually, that's what I would think would lead to a highly cohesive society that would allow for these kind of things to happen.
Well, it didn't end up happening because there was mass class conflict because workers, particularly agricultural workers, were deeply dissatisfied with the level of political power that was guaranteed to the aristocracy and which they didn't possess. So what ended up happening after threats of extraordinary violence committed by the aristocracy against workers was the formation of what's called the Great Compact, where there was agreement on the part of industry and the aristocracy to cede a tremendous amount of power to workers in return for workers not engaging in more extreme forms of social radicalism, like a transition to communism. And this formed the glue upon which the contemporary Nordic social democratic model was based, the Great Compact. Now, is it perfect?
Do you see this breaking down currently?
It depends really on where you're talking about, right? I would actually say that in Denmark, one of the things that's really...
In Sweden.
In Sweden, with the rise of the new nationalist parties?
I'm not going to attribute to any one condition, but I see a lot of the social cohesion and trust breaking apart. And to me, that symbolizes that, again, to me, high social trust is what these systems rely on. And if the high social trust goes away, then these systems...
Okay, but sure. But high social trust has to be predicated upon actually providing benefits to the people at the bottom. And one of the things that you really see in the Nordic model is a kind of social democracy or democratic socialism, because a lot of the parties that implemented it, like the Labour Party or the Swedish Social Democratic Party, were committed to various forms of democratic socialism, is that you need to create a system where people see the tangible benefits in their lives of accepting the parameters established by liberal democracy, B, recognizing that there's going to be peaceful transferences of power between more conservative groups and more radical groups, and these will occur periodically throughout history, and C, that social trust has to be predicated on actually delivering a wealthy and prosperous society that works for the least well off and the best well off.
But I don't understand. So if for instance, social trust is based on having sort of a common moral system, that's usually what social trust is based on. If you had, if you tried to implement the Norway model in Haiti, do you think it would work? Because like, if you just came in, implemented the social programs in Haiti, without any of the cultural trappings, would it work?
Well, it might work if you didn't constantly have
seriously, okay.
If you didn't have the French try to invade the country.
The French are not currently invading Haiti. I'm talking about.
You didn't have the Americans try to invade, and then in the early 20th
I'm talking about today. Like that happened. The French in Haiti, that was 200 years ago.
So you're talking about whether or not we could implement something that
Norway in Afghanistan, in Haiti, in some low trust society. Would then the institutions create the trust, or would the institutions be unable to operate because of the cultural conditions on the ground?
Oh, I think that absolutely you can see higher levels of social trust for the implementation of these programs. So let's take another example.
So would it work? Could we just put the government of Norway in charge of Haiti and...
No, of course not, because the government of Norway does no familiarity with the actual political and cultural context in that community. But let's.
I thought you said the cultural stuff would be driven away by just the strength of the economic policies and stuff like that.
Because it can be, right? Because culture follows economics in a very important way. And what you saw in Sweden, Norway, Denmark was a formation of a society whose material base seemed to function for the wide majority of society. And this led to a broad cultural consensus around the Broad Compact, right? So here you very clearly see an instance of culture and trust following from economic, and for that matter, also political.
So let's make a Haitian Grand Compact.
That would be a wonderful thing.
How would you do that?
Well, let's talk again about the case today that I was thinking about, Mexico, right? So Mexico is a society with high levels of crime, very, very low levels of trust in social institutions, a long-standing history of violence. Let's be very clear about that. And that's also been routinely subject to various forms of U.S. imperialism and, French colonial imperialism, every kind of imperialism you can imagine, right? The current government right now, for the first time in the country's democratic history, led by an anti-neoliberal, is actually enjoying majority of support from over 50% of the population. He has implemented a variety of welfare measures that have made him extremely popular with the poor, including actually expanding access to things like healthcare. And it does seem to be working, right? Now, is it perfect? No. But you do see in these circumstances the kind of power that can come from actually trying to make life meaningfully better for people at the very bottom of the social rung, and the kind of cultural shifts and the engendering of trust that flows from that. And I don't think that you can form that unless there is a willingness on the part of elites to cede their power and to cede a lot of economic benefits to the people at the bottom of society who very rightly feel like they are not benefiting from the status quo.
I think that this is just a model that has not worked in my experience. It seems to me, in your kind of perception of the world, like it's just a matter of sort of pressing the social democratic button hard enough and getting rid of right-wing political parties.
Well, I don't think so. And I would argue that right-wing political parties are actually vital partners in any one of these projects. There's a lot of good political science research that shows that social democracy and democracy generally cannot work unless conservative parties have agreed to comport themselves to democracy, which historically they have not, except in a few circumstances. But now, for the most part, they do. So I'm in no way, shape, or form saying that we should marginalize or get rid of conservative parties. If anything, we need them to be partners in a parliamentary democratic system, or
partners in helping you get what you want, I guess, right? And also blaming them for the problems, right?
Well, that's partisan politics for you, right? I'm sure that in the contemporary Republican situation that we're in right now, you would probably spend an awful lot of your time, and I know you would because you've been doing that today, blaming progressives for the problems that we have. Right? I'm
talking about the places I've actually lived.
Sure.
But these places, like, if progressive Christianity worked, if these things worked, I would still be a progressive. and these systems are currently failing and have failed in the past. And I think that the solution is, I think that progressivism is great at sort of selling itself as a solution to these problems, but I just don't see solutions to these problems ever materializing.
Well, I mean, they clearly have materialized in the examples that I gave you, right? I mean,
In
the Nordic states,
Vancouver?
the Nordic states that you like to chastise are the most
I am
successful.
not hold on, Matt. I am not
Okay,
chastised.
so the Nordic societies then that you are kind of marginalizing are the most successful models of human society that we've seen thus far. That does not mean that they are utopias in any way, shape, or form, because there is no utopia, right? Out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight will ever be made, right? But it seems very clear that the social compact that was enacted between workers and elites in the country, where elites would cede a great deal of their power and cede economic concessions to workers in return for the implementation of highly democratic systems, does seem to be something that is functional. Can that be exported elsewhere? I think so, yes, but it's going to look very different depending on context. And I should point out that as a conservative, you should be very,
I'm not a
open.
conservative, Matt.
Okay, sorry. Well, as a right winger, you should be sensitive to this, because one of the good things that the reactionary tradition does stress is that local conditions matter, and any kind of political solution that
you've told me it's not local conditions matter. You've told me that you can export things willy-nilly across the board, and
I said that you can export a model, but it has to be sensitive to local conditions, and it's not going to look the same everywhere that you go, right? For that matter, social democracy does not look the same in Sweden as it does in Denmark, as it does in Iceland, as it does in Finland, right? But there are
pretty similar relative to differences between most governments, but yeah.
Sure, exactly. But they're sensitive to the fact that local contexts are significant, local histories are important, and they've been able to adapt a relatively comparable model with a great deal of success in those contexts. And given the fact that we live in a far larger and far richer country, where economies of scale means that we could implement many of the same kind of social policies, probably at lower cost and at lower risk, I see no reason why we shouldn't do so.
Is your prediction then that these social democratic models are going to, they're doing great, they're going to just continue thriving? Because that's just not my impression, right? I mean, obviously California is getting more social democratic. They're getting they're spending more tax money. They're taxing more. They're spending it on their programs. I don't have a say in what they spend it on. Certainly that's where America is going to. So your prediction for the future would be very rosy, I take it.
No, not at all, right? I think that looking at the past, we have every reason to be pessimistic about the future, right?
Why? Considering that they're all kind of spending more money.
No, because I agree with the kind of Gramscian axiom, right? That you need to engage in pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, right? So the social democratic model that was implemented.
I'm not talking about predictions, though, right?
Okay, so I'm getting into that, right? So the social democratic model that reached its halcyon days in the 1950s was extremely successful in many respects. It had deep failings, particularly in its treatment of racialized communities, especially in the United States. But we don't need to get into that, right?
Yeah, I think we'll skip that.
But since the 1970s, we've seen the consistent rollback of these kinds of programs by a wide variety of neoliberal and conservative groups, many of whom have re-entrenched class power at the highest echelons of government, and who have.
Can I ask a question about that? What other than welfare reform, what was the last time we cut entitlements?
Sorry, when was the last time we cut entitlements?
Yeah.
Oh, I can't remember. It was probably
well, so you can't name it.
1990s.
Welfare reform, right?
Yeah.
So these aren't, their entitlement programs aren't being rolled back.
They have been in many other circumstances. I'm not just talking about the United States, right? Think about the attack on the NHS and public housing in something like the United Kingdom, right? I'm talking about more general macrological trends right here. But there's no doubt that something like Obamism in the United States, even if it didn't succeed in actually reestablishing something like the welfarist consensus, did a little bit to kind of halt the damage. Okay, so not very much, but a little bit. So we're not just talking about the
that expanded the purview of government control over healthcare, certainly.
Yeah, in order to establish one of the most mediocre, in fact, one of the poorest kind of systems of public health that are existing in the Western world right now. But
you're preaching to the choir.
I'm glad, right? So what I'm trying to get at, though, is, again, I am not pessimistic at all, right? I think that there are reasons to think that the future might be better than the past, that we can see in the various kinds of left-wing movements that have emerged, particularly in Latin America, in places like Chile or Mexico, or for that matter, also in Brazil, right? And I also think that the emergence of things like democratic socialism in the United States is reason to be somewhat optimistic. But if we look at the broader trajectory of the last 50 years, while there have been bumps in the road that have signified certain kinds of improvement, overall the trajectory has been downward, right?
Yes.
Unionization rates have declined. We've seen declining real wages for vast numbers of people, particularly in the most vulnerable sectors. There is this real collective reverence for a meritocratic mythology that is just that, a mythology. And it's going to take some very serious work in order to combat that. And do I think that we can do it? I do think so. Do I think it's going to be easy, or that there's any kind of teleology of history that makes the victory of my kind of viewpoint inevitable? Absolutely not.
Well, I think, I mean, the last 60 years have been total disasters.
We agree on that.
Society, and it seems like it was also the ascendancy of I mean, it wasn't the ascendancy of socialism, certainly, but it was the ascendancy of this idiotic individualist idea of following your own pleasure and abandoning communities. And I don't see how, if that idea stays. I mean, like, okay, people are meritocratic.
Okay.
Not really. They're hedonistic. That's what the domination
that's for sure,
is.
right? So,
and so I don't see meritocracy. My grandparents were more meritocratic than my generation.
Okay, I do have to go because my wife is asking me to spend time with her, and I probably should agree with that. Cool. So let's just end on this, right? Because this could be a point of consensus, right? I do absolutely think that the kind of individualism that you are talking about, that conceives of the world exclusively in terms of winners and losers, and conceives it in that way because people think that the primary motivation in life should be the pursuit of hedonic pleasure, has been an absolute disaster for every kind of community that it has touched. And not only has it been an absolute disaster economically, it has had spiritually and communitarian and collectively corrosive effects. And I don't think that we're very likely to be able to overcome this in the near future. I think it's going to take an awful lot of work, and it's going to require a profound reconfiguration of the way that people think about community, value, and contribution, particularly in the United States, but of course across the broader society, broader Western world as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. People have to be broken out of their individualism, but I don't know what's going to teach them that other than law and or religion, which are the two historical ways that this occurs. But thank you very much, Professor. I have to answer super chats if you can't stay on, so I'll go through the rest of them if you have to go.
No problem.
Thank you for joining me. So it was a lot of fun, and I'll probably talk to you some other time, maybe. If not, good luck on your book, I guess.
And I do want to say, I did have fun. I know that we got a little bit heated there and stuff, but anyway, thanks for having me on. And take care of yourself.
Cheers. Bye. Okay, guys. I'll answer the rest of the super chats. So Creeper Weirdo I already answered. Pseudo-analysis gives me a $25 with a heart. Fritz Imperial already answered that one. Okay, Xavier Golem Gensky. I wish I'd asked this one. In my experience, pursuing my gender identity led to misery and self-hatred, while accepting my birth gender brought me a huge amount of peace. Why is my experience not worth spreading, but the counter is? I mean, this is sort of the big contradiction that I saw kind of in Matt was the stuff on individualism. It's very clear that he did not approve of all lifestyles and all opinions. It was very clear he was very able to condemn traditional religious views when spoken out loud, but he couldn't condemn pornography or prostitution or drug use, things that actively destroy families. And, at the same time, we have to pretend like, oh, wow, someone has a right-wing opinion. Someone has a traditional opinion on homosexuality or polygamy and trans stuff. And the issue with this trans stuff is it so obviously does not work. This gay marriage hat trick was something that I definitely feel cheated about. And in the sense that I actually believed that the direction of the LGBT community would be towards normality. And instead, it was just towards more hedonism. What the LGBTQ movement begot was more deconstruction after it got its initial deconstruction. And I don't know what to tell you. If you're gonna chase gender, you're never gonna catch that train. It will always be moving away from you faster than you can possibly catch up with it. But thank you, Xavier. I'm going to go on to Creeper Weirdo. Again, to the good professor. What does a good leftist or left-wing family look like? We already asked that one. Brits Imperial. Matt, Christianity is about Christ being the Son of God, dying and resurrecting, not a political economic policy. If you can't boldly declare his divinity, you aren't Christian. Unmute me on Twitter. Well, Fritz, I asked the spirit of this question. I saw this and I couldn't ask him directly because he's in the middle of a spiel. But I asked the spirit of your question when I kind of emphasized the fact that he literally didn't believe. And I mean, come on, man. Like, let's not kill. This is the other thing too. Like, why do leftists? And I didn't get to ask them this. Like, why do analysis if you don't have clear definitions? If the words that you're analyzing can change definitions from person to person, don't bother discussing them analytically. Well, what's solidifying you? There's two things that solidify you. Formal logic on clear definitions, which is a very small minority of the time, and then experience, which you could also replace an experiment. Those are the two things that lead to consensus, not this endless analysis of words. When you change the meaning of the words, if you say, like, I believe in the Nicene Creed, but I don't believe in the physical resurrection of Christ, or I don't believe in the Trinity, or they're just symbols, or I don't believe in the Church of Christ, or I don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. I don't know what you mean. All you're telling me is that you believe in a creed, but then you're redefining the words of the creed to not mean what the words of the creed were meant to believe, to indicate. So I don't know. I mean, this is sort of a method. As far as synthesis goes, I mean, really, guys, it's going to be up to us. I mean, I'll be honest here, right? Like, what I really want to see Matt do, I want to, if I were to do an experiment to figure out something about Matt McManus's point of view, I'd have to put him in an alternative world. The alternative world I want to put Matt McManus in, and this is not some kind of like vindictive thing. It's just an experiment. What would he do if, instead of having to write a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, he had to write a statement about his adherence to right-wing reactionary point of view? And every single conference he went to, people would be looking to have those politics reflected back on him. Would he, in his principle, maintain his progressivism and very likely lose his job for it? Or would he conform to the consensus of his peers? I honestly don't know what the answer would be, but I think that would tell you a lot about sort of his brand of progressivism. Because I don't know. I mean, this is the thing, right? I mean, maybe Matt is a sincere one, right? But you can't help but look at this. I can't help the raw reality that if you put these diversity, equity, and inclusion statements to all the great philosophers of history, and they answer that diversity, equity, and inclusion statement honestly, like they all, none of them would have gotten tenure, none of them would have gotten their grants approved. They all would have been weeded out by human resources departments. Yet somehow, coincidentally, despite the fact that all philosophers in history would never have come to this consensus independently themselves, somehow in a moment when HR decides that this is going to be the philosophical standard they want to enforce, everyone magically agrees. Everyone, it's like it's a big coincidence. No, most of those people must be cynical. That's just the reality, and they're not all like collectively coming to these conclusions or organically. That's impossible. This is a product of an institutional push. I already answered C. Carter's Wretched of the Earth. Creeper Weirdo says, one last one for the good professor. I want to worship God and Jesus, not LGBTQs. All I see from progressive Christians are full submission to modern dogma. Where is Christ in that? I mean, yeah, we kind of answered. I tried to combine these questions at the end. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is, you'll see this in every town. Huge rows of unoccupied modern progressive churches, and then nothing else other than they're all empty on Sundays. Pac-Man Respecter, yeah. Or do you think progressives are inherently bad at implementing policy? I ask because your response to crime, drug, family formation, as not having the desired results is frequently policy being poorly implemented. Right-wingers have little or no power in many of these areas discussed. I think his answer was that they haven't done it hard enough, and that Bernie Sanders would be the guy for the job, I guess. I don't know why you'd believe that. Arden Cobb for $3 USA. Excuse me. Matt, why is your view on people that they are capable of inherent virtues for collective decision making is diversion from people on the right who don't think that people can self-govern? Well, yeah, I asked him this question. I mean, I don't think I ever really got a good answer, because his idea is nothing can ever be made good from the crooked timber of humanity, but we should let people take heroin if they want to and not stop them, unless they indicate that they want to stop when they're being fully accommodated with facilities that make taking heroin incredibly easy. No, again, I mean, it's the test that most progressives put to Christians. If these poor drug abusers were your children, would you just keep them in a hospital and keep on feeding them heroin? No, you wouldn't. You take the heroin away from them. You take the needles away from them. You'd force them, you'd lock them in their rooms and put them cold turkey for 2 weeks until they got off of the junk. And no, but we don't treat people. We don't treat this libertarian shit. The libertarian shit pisses me off more than the socialist stuff. Like, there's something sort of perennially innocent about the socialist constantly believing that this time he's going to kick the football when it's lined up in front of him. I kind of respect that a little bit as a religious person. You know, as someone who has to eternally expect God at any time, I can respect Matt for wanting socialism at any time. But what really pisses me off is the libertarianism thing, because it fundamentally, we don't respect people enough to defend them from their own decision to kill themselves. And if you don't stop your own children from killing themselves, you don't love your children. I'm sorry, right? If you don't stop your children from killing themselves, you don't love your children. Pac-Man Respecter for $5 USA. To be concise as possible, progressive social policies are not succeeding as expected because of economic conditions. Broadly, yes or no, if you please. Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. Is like, okay, it's neoliberalism, but he had this impression that we had cut entitlements, but I mean, all we did was sort of modify welfare a little bit in the late 90s, and then we modified it back again. Entitlements spending has been going up and up and up and up, and so has spending on government boondoggles and government gifts to NGOs. Government spending has only been going up in inflation-adjusted dollars, and since Obama, it's been going up as a percentage of the GDP, as far as I remember. And I don't know. I guess I still don't know what Matt meant by neoliberalism. When I think of neoliberalism, I think of NAFTA and mass migration, because that is what changes the dynamic between labor and capital on a global scale. And it changes it globally, too. NAFTA globally increased the power of capital. Mass migration globally increased the power of capital, because capital has movement limitations that aren't just investment, and so mass migration helps it. And obviously, I don't need to express why just generally allowing people to free trade increases the power of capital as well. So I have no idea what he meant by that. Every time a progressive, if a Pac-Man Respecter for $5 says, every time a progressive policy fails, it's because of other adjacent conditions. Yes. Ad infinitum. Yeah, I don't know what you want me to say. That's the truth. That's the truth. Yeah. Well, guys, that seems to be the end of the stream, and I hope you found it enlightening. I guess I didn't really get to ask my question. I mean, it was kind of just more or less questioning his economic policies. I kind of was hoping, well, I didn't really have control enough of the conversation to ask him how he actually expected this to improve right-wing communities, or if he wanted to make them improve. I don't know. Oh, someone asked me what's on my shirt. It's a quote from Machiavelli. It says, how we live life is so different from how we ought to live that the whole studies what ought to do. It's just a quote saying basically you should be political realists. So, I mean, I don't know. It's the crux, in my mind, the crux of the whole debate was on the issue of drugs and pornography and not taking away drugs from people who's killing themselves with drugs. That's kind of what shocked me a little bit. And again, it's not even a libertarian. It's not even a socialist thing. It's a libertarian thing. Yeah, I'm not so sure what could really change someone's opinion about that. I'm trying to think what else I learned here. I guess I was expecting him to go harder on the social policies. I already knew the whole thing about the paradox of tolerance thing. Like, okay, I want you to stop sending me nasty emails with pictures of German U-boats on them or something. And then maybe after we defeat capitalism, we'll stop firing you from your jobs for not asserting the metaphysical reality that trans women are women or something like that. All right. Well, guys, that was a very, very long live stream. I'll talk to you later and have a wonderful evening. I hope to at some point resume my podcast, but I've been very busy with other stuff. So in the meantime, have a wonderful rest of the week.